She was a beloved grandmother who knew the value of hard work.
Here's somebody who only a few years before came from Puerto Rico with nothing, and now she was buying a brownstone in New York City.
And he seemed like the perfect partner to share it with.
He was very polite, very nice.
She loved the attention that he gave her.
He seemed like the type of guy she could spend the rest of her life with.
But a brutal double homicide will tear them apart forever.
It was a horrific crime scene.
It was almost like overkill.
And to know that the little girl was there, it's just shocking.
The hunt for a killer will reveal a tangled web of suspects.
He was a player, P-L-A-Y-A.
I said, just tell me what happened.
There's some kind of love triangle.
She let her guard down, and that was a fatal mistake.
You can never be too sure about the company that you keep.
This act was pure evil.
They were just an evil gargoyle.
December 1st, 2001, East Harlem, New York. It's a lively Saturday in El Barrio, also known as Spanish Harlem.
Harlem is a part of Manhattan, but there's one section of Harlem that's called Spanish Harlem, and it's a mixed blend of people from Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, any kind of Spanish-speaking country.
El barrio is a word which means community. So in Spanish, the Latinos, when they talk about where they live, they'll say El barrio.
The whole block looked like Sesame Street. We had folks from all over, and it was very friendly.
But at one El Barrio home, NYPD is moving in for a welfare check on one of its residents.
They have reason to believe that 52-year-old Carmen Quinones is in trouble.
Earlier that day, after family had been trying to reach Carmen for nearly 24 hours, someone finally answered the landline. But it wasn't Carmen.
Carmen's 3-year-old granddaughter, Natalie, answered the phone.
As much as a 3-year-old could articulate what happened, she said, "Grandma's on the floor."
Since Carmen's family lives out of town, they immediately called the police to go over to the residence.
The officers responding knew this was a serious call.
But upon arriving at the residence, there's one sign of good news.
They're happy to discover that the little girl, that Natalie, is okay.
However, as officers make their way into the home, nothing can prepare them for the disturbing scene ahead.
They walked into the living room, and there on the floor was 2 people fatally stabbed.
You got a double homicide?
One of the victims is Carmen Quinones.
Puerto Rican immigrant Carmen Quinones embodied the essence of El Barrio.
Carmen was a very nice person. She knew people at the corner store. She knew her next door neighbors. Everybody pretty much knew who she was because of how kind she was.
When I needed somebody, Carmen was there. She was a wonderful lady.
Carmen was a very hard worker. She worked multiple jobs when she got to America.
Just in terms of some of her ability to pivot and learn another culture, another language, that just really speaks to her resilience.
And over the years, she saved up enough money to buy her own home, a beautiful brownstone in Spanish Harlem.
A brownstone, usually it's a 3-story building made out of brick. And it's divided first floor, second floor, and third floor.
Carmen decided to live on the ground floor apartment, and she rented the 2 top apartments.
Here's somebody who only a few years before came from Puerto Rico with nothing, and now she was buying a brownstone in New York City.
This American dream that most people come to America to fulfill, she did that.
So it was no surprise when she connected with a fellow immigrant, Justino de Jesus.
Justino De Jesus, he was a nice gentleman. He was also from Puerto Rico, so Carmen and him definitely had a lot in common when it came to that.
The two married in 1977 and had both a son and a daughter.
But as the years passed, the couple started growing apart.
The relationship between Carmen and Justino was on the rocks. They weren't getting along. Justino had a good job working for an elevator company, but then he lost his job.
Soon, even friends in the neighborhood could sense tension in the marriage.
When things got too much, he'd go and he'd be sitting on his soup in the night.
Carmen couldn't take the marriage anymore, and eventually they got divorced.
But the divorce was amicable, and Carmen even allowed Justino to stay in the brownstone.
She allowed him to move to the very top apartment on the 3rd floor of the same brownstone.
People didn't just jump up and leave a brownstone. It was more economical for them to stay together, split the expenses of the house. It was the most amicable separation.
So that plumbing in the bathroom's fixed.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. That's so helpful.
Oh.
And while you're here, do you mind the garbage disposal's kind of acting up? Can you check on that?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
What's going on here?
He lived there rent-free, only to the condition where he just had to keep up with the maintenance of the entire brownstone. So in Carmen's eyes, she got an in-house super, and she's able to work the apartment as a landlord.
Oh, where's Natalie?
Oh, I put her down for a nap.
Around that same time, Carmen's granddaughter, Natalie, had moved in with her while Natalie's mother was in school upstate.
However, just because she was a recently divorced grandmother, Carmen had not given up on living life to the fullest.
She started dating a fellow Puerto Rican immigrant from the community named Ruben Frederick.
When she first started going out with Ruben, she introduced me to him. And pretty soon, he was just like anybody else coming in the block. He was very polite, very nice.
They went out all the time. They enjoyed each other's company. And he just loved Carmen, and she loved the attention that he gave her.
Ruben was kind, he was thoughtful, and he really seemed like the type of guy that Carmen could spend the rest of her life with.
A steady income, a beautiful home, and newfound romance. By 2001, Carmen Quiñones seemed to have it all. But now police in New York's 23rd precinct have found the 52-year-old grandmother deceased on her living room floor. And she isn't the only victim.
They determined the second victim to be Carmen's boyfriend, Ruben Frederick.
Carmen and Ruben have both suffered several stab wounds.
There wasn't much to go on except the basics. You have 2 people fatally stabbed inside in a brownstone apartment, and police are now looking for a motive and the killer.
As night falls on Spanish Harlem, NYPD homicide detectives arrive to launch their investigation.
It was a horrific crime scene. There was blood all over the floor. On the walls, it was blood spatter. It was horrible, horrible.
Based on the condition of the bodies, detectives suspect the victims have been dead for about 20 hours.
When you have coagulation, it's thick and it's drying. So that means it's more than several hours that the body's been there. And to know that the little girl was there, it's just shocking. A horrible situation to be for a little girl.
The apartment is in disarray. There are drawers open, clothes everywhere. The apartment is completely ransacked.
Could this be a robbery gone wrong? Police examine the front door for more clues.
It didn't appear that the door was broken in any way, shape, or form, so the officers knew that somebody had to be let in to the apartment.
We haven't located any signs of forced entry.
Which raises one possible theory.
We were thinking that perhaps it was what was known as a push-in robbery, that you're accosted on the street, followed into the building, and then the horrific crime occurred inside the apartment.
But when police take a closer look at the bedroom, evidence suggests this isn't a typical break-in.
They picked up the mattress and they found a stash of cash. It was $16,000 in cash.
As soon as we saw $16,000, it struck us as very strange.
Did this strange find have something to do with what happened to the couple?
It looks like someone may have wanted that money. Someone dangerous.
New York detectives investigating the double homicide of 52-year-old Carmen Quiñones and her boyfriend Ruben Frederick have just made a surprising discovery inside Carmen's bedroom.
They picked up the mattress and they found a stash of cash. It was $16,000 in cash.
It struck us as very strange. Right away we were thinking, could this be a gambling location? Could this be a narcotics location?
Can I get someone at the precinct to run a check on this address?
But those theories are quickly dispelled.
When we ran it through our computer system, nothing came up. The location was totally clean.
Background checks on Carmen and Ruben are clean as well.
They had never been in trouble before. No touch of anything with law enforcement whatsoever.
Both of them are exemplary citizens without even so much as a traffic ticket.
Hey, check this out.
And upon further investigation, detectives find a legitimate explanation for the cash.
We've recovered rent receipts that the money was from, rent being paid by the two tenants on the second floor. And Carmen kept the money underneath his bed rather than put it in the bank. She just didn't trust banks.
With no signs of criminal activity or forced entry, detectives changed their focus.
This really kind of shifted the narrative to this could be something more personal.
But who could have targeted the happy couple in such a brutal attack? Police won't be able to get the answers they need from Carmen's 3-year-old granddaughter, Natalie.
You just cannot bare bone throw questions at a 3-year-old because their memory is different. They remember things differently, and they're still learning, and their brains are still developing. They don't know all the words, and they don't know how to explain what they saw.
So now detectives are looking to talk to neighbors to see if they heard anything, they saw anything, or if Carmen had any problems with anyone.
Of course, they want to speak to the residents that live upstairs, so they start on the second floor.
When they speak to the tenant, he isn't able to offer much help. He can't imagine who would want to hurt Carmen.
She was very sweet, but, she kept to herself like most people around her.
They were very surprised, shocked. They said it was, a quiet block, a good block.
The tenant also says he didn't hear anything the night before because he wasn't home.
I was at work. My supervisor can vouch for that.
He had a solid alibi. He was not in the home at the time of the murders.
The investigators hope they'll have more luck with the third-story residents. But when they ask for more information on them, they're thrown for a loop.
They find out that there's a gentleman living on the third floor who happens to be Carmen's ex-husband.
Detectives were a little surprised to find out that Carmen's ex-husband lived up on the third floor.
Yeah, it's a little weird, but, they seem to make it work.
And detectives are even more surprised to find out that Carmen's ex, Justino de Jesus, doesn't live there alone.
The third floor, it was Justino and his new wife, Maria.
This immediately sets off alarm bells for the detectives.
The officers definitely thought that was quite interesting and also kind of odd. Where in the world does the ex-husband and their new wife live in the same home as the ex-wife?
We didn't know who did it. Everybody's considered a suspect.
As NYPD investigates the fatal stabbings of Carmen Quiñones and her boyfriend Ruben Frederick, the tight-knit neighborhood of Spanish Harlem remains stunned.
I was really shocked. I kept saying, why somebody want to torture them? They were human. They were people.
But after discovering Carmen's ex-husband, Justino, and his new wife, Maria, live upstairs in the third-floor apartment, investigators are wondering if this attack may have come from inside the home.
Yeah, it's a little weird, but, they seem to make it work.
Per the report of the neighbors, there was never any inclination of anything that would warrant a second look at them.
They kind of lived amicably. I mean, there was no arguing. They just learned how to live with each other.
Just as police set out to find them, Justino and Maria arrive outside the residence.
What's going on?
He came home and he was going, whoa, what's this?
We need to talk. There's been a homicide.
So as the officers are talking to Justino and Maria, they let them know that Carmen and Ruben are dead.
What? That can't be.
We're gonna need both of you to come with us to answer some questions.
In the beginning, everybody's considered a suspect.
They both seem really upset, but they agree to go back to the station with the investigators.
They interviewed them separately in different rooms. They want to make sure they both told the same story.
Detectives sit down with Justino first, and he seems genuinely shocked by what's transpired.
I just can't believe it.
He was like, no, it can't be. There's no way anybody that I know is involved in killing Carmen.
He lets them know that they are still friends, that he had no reason to harm her, and certainly not harm her knowing that his granddaughter is in the apartment with her.
But investigators aren't letting Justino off the hook just yet.
Police believe the murders took place on November 30th, so where was Justino during that time?
And can you attest for your whereabouts on November 30th?
Yeah, absolutely.
Justino claims that both he and his wife were out all day.
They had alibis. Justino was working. Maria was out doing errands.
And Justino says when they returned home, nothing seemed out of the ordinary.
As far as I could tell, everything seemed normal with the house.
He didn't see or hear anything that would indicate a murder had taken place inside the residence.
In the next room, Justino's wife Maria corroborates her husband's statement.
It was a busy day for me. I had a lot of errands to run.
I remember she said that she went to pick up some glasses, reading glasses, and she had to do a couple of stops. And then she returned home.
They believed she didn't know anything.
Justino and Maria also agree to let the police search their third-floor apartment.
They don't find a murder weapon. They don't find any blood. They don't find anything that indicates that these two individuals had anything to do with the crime that occurred downstairs.
So now detectives are stymied. They don't have any motive, no suspects.
Is it possible Carmen's boyfriend, Ruben Frederick, was the true target of this brutal crime?
They've looked at everything that they could possibly look at on Carmen's side. So now they have to determine what's the deal with Ruben.
They saw that he was a bus driver for a private company, and then they found out that he lived in Brooklyn.
And that's when they make a shocking new discovery.
To their surprise, he does not live alone in Brooklyn.
They determined that Ruben is actually married.
There's some kind of, love triangle.
New York homicide detectives investigating the brutal double homicide of Carmen Quiñones and her boyfriend, Ruben Frederick, have just uncovered a surprising new twist in the case.
Investigators discovered that Ruben is married to a woman who lives in Brooklyn. So now they have to look into this person.
At the same time he's dating Carmen, he has a wife back at home.
There's some kind of, love triangle.
Later that day, detectives sit down with Ruben's wife, Gloria.
They ask her about Ruben. She says, yeah, that's my husband.
I'm afraid we have some unfortunate news.
They tell her that Ruben was, fatally stabbed to death. She was surprised, upset, and they add that he was found dead in the apartment of his girlfriend.
No wonder I couldn't get a hold of him.
But Gloria doesn't seem particularly shocked to hear that her husband was with another woman.
She told police that, he had several girlfriends over the years during their marriage.
She knew he was a player, Playa, and she more or less sort of accepted it.
But I still loved him regardless.
According to Gloria, on the day of the murders, Ruben told her he was working.
I thought he was at the bus company.
He told his wife he was going to work a triple shift, and that was to cover up where he was really going to be, which was at Coleman's apartment.
And when detectives ask Gloria where she was that day, she's able to provide an alibi.
I was with my friends. They can vouch for me.
They were able to confirm that pretty quickly. So now they were back to square one.
After speaking with Gloria, detectives called the bus company to speak with Ruben's manager.
I called them up and I said, listen, I need help.
They start getting information from the boss about Ruben's shift, how often he worked there.
Ruben's boss assures police he was a reliable employee who got along with everyone.
As far as they knew, he had no enemies. They couldn't offer police any motive of who would want to kill him.
But in passing, Ruben's boss mentioned something that catches their attention.
The boss said, do you have his cell phone?
Ruben had a phone from the company. He used it all the time.
And so now the police are wondering, what cell phone? They didn't find one in the home.
I went back. I'm looking for something that said cell phone from the scene. There was none. So I'm like, where is this phone?
Ruben's boss gives the detectives the phone number. So the police subpoena the records of the phone.
And when the records come in, detectives know they're on the right track.
A few days later, they call me. They said, we have phone calls from that phone. I said, okay. Is the phone still active? They said yes. And we have several phone calls that were dialed out of the phone after the murders. And they said, whoa, wow, that's interesting.
Obviously, it was not made by Ruben because he was dead. So now they were trying to figure out who was using this phone and who were they calling.
Detectives contact the recipients of those calls to ask who called them from that number.
Each phone call recipient gives the same name, Carlos Diaz.
Now, who the heck is Carlos Diaz?
Detectives run Carlos's name through their system.
Carlos Diaz doesn't have a record of any significance. He's not, a heavy hitter.
They see he got some arrests, mostly petty crimes, but they figure if he has Ruben's phone, he's the killer.
They feel like they've hit the jackpot at this point. And now this person is taken into custody.
Once they get Carlos in an interrogation room, detectives turn up the heat.
They're asking him, do you know Carmen? Do you know Ruben? And he's looking at them like, who are these people?
I don't know what you're talking about, Meg. And how did we find this in your pocket?
But when detectives confront him about Ruben's phone, Carlos has an explanation.
I was going to clone it. I just haven't gotten around it yet.
He lets them know that he's a phone cloner, meaning that he takes the SIM card out of one phone and puts it into another phone and uses the minutes up on that one and transfer that SIM card to another one.
Back then, they would clone the phone and they would bang out thousands of dollars worth of calls and then get rid of it.
It gives people the ability to, use the phone without having to pay for the service.
Okay, that still doesn't explain how you got Ruben's phone.
The point is, he has the SIM card belonging to Ruben, and the police are wondering, well, where'd you get this from?
He thinks he's just there for a phone that he cloned. I said, no, you're not here because of a phone. You're here because that phone belonged to 2 people that were murdered.
Murder?
He goes, let me tell you, detective, I might be a lot of things, but I'm not a murderer.
All right, listen. I got this from another guy a few days ago. A guy who goes by Doggy.
He said, Doggy gave it to me. I said, Doggy? Who's Doggy? He said, he lives in my neighborhood. He wanted this phone cloned.
What's Doggy's real name? His name is Rafael Rios.
Sure enough, he identifies him. Rafael Rios.
What does he have to do with Carmen and Ruben's murder?
That's when Carlos drops another name.
He says Rafael gave him instructions to hand the cloned phone over to another man from the neighborhood named Raymond Mundo.
Now detectives have not 1, but 2 additional suspects on their hands.
What do you know about this Raymond guy? That's the one you don't mess around with.
He said, like, Raymond's a real bad guy. He's, like, a little afraid of him. He even said, I was going to clone the phone for free.
When detectives pull Raymond's criminal history, they see that Carlos is telling the truth.
Raymond has recently been released from prison after serving 6 years.
And the crime sounds eerily familiar.
He did a home invasion with a knife. When we saw his MO and what he did, we was like, this is the guy.
Nearly a week after Carmen Quinones and her boyfriend Ruben Frederick were fatally stabbed to death, New York investigators have unearthed 2 new suspects in the crime, Rafael Rios and Raymond Mundo.
Both men have a criminal record, but there's something in Raymond's rap sheet that really stands out to investigators.
Raymond has recently been released after serving 6 years in prison for an eerily similar crime.
He did a home invasion with a knife. When we saw his MO and what he did, we was like, this is the guy.
But other than their involvement with Ruben's phone, what's Raymond and Rafael's connection to the murdered couple?
If they're the killers, why did they do it?
At that point, we were just concentrating on these 2 people from the Bronx, and we needed to know why.
Police immediately move in to locate the 2 suspects.
Rafael and Raymond happen to live in the same building.
Raymond is nowhere to be found. However, they are able to locate Rafael and bring him in for questioning.
At the station, detectives press Rafael about his involvement in the murders, but he refuses to talk.
I don't know what you're talking about.
This guy is not bending, and I don't think they expected him to. He's been down this road of being questioned by the police before. He knows what to say and what not to say.
But eventually, Rafael starts to realize his stonewalling isn't going to work.
We break it down, and I said, listen, there was a double homicide in East Harlem, and it points out that you have the phone that belonged to one of the victims. So that's when he kind of realizes that he's not going anywhere right now.
Come on, Rafael, it's time to tell the truth.
So I said, just tell me what happened.
Okay.
So he basically says, Mundo and I went to East Harlem, and we did this crime.
He gave a 10-page written confession. He gave up the whole thing.
Rafael says on November 30th, he and Raymond posed as detectives to sneak into Carmen Quinones' brownstone.
They said police. So Carmen opened the door slightly.
Yes?
They were dressed in, like suits or shirt and tie, so to look the part, And they had pads like they were detectives, taking notes.
With the NYPD, can we come in?
Rafael says that's when Carmen sensed something wasn't right.
She went to slam the door, but it was too late.
She let her guard down, and that was a fatal mistake. That was the beginning of the end.
Before she could even say anything, Raymond stabs her in the chest with a knife and pushes his way into the apartment. Ruben, who's in the back room, hears all this. He comes running in, and he starts fighting with the two men.
Even though Ruben is outnumbered, he puts up quite a fight.
Ruben was very agile, and he was no slouch. He was a built man.
They had a team up on him.
They finish them off, stab them until they're not breathing anymore.
Carmen and Ruben are each stabbed over 20 times.
Shortly thereafter, the killers realized there was someone else in the apartment, Carmen's 3-year-old granddaughter, Natalie.
When they spotted the little girl in the apartment, they were shocked. So they spoke amongst each other and said, what are we gonna do?
Raphael said, she's little, she didn't see anything, she doesn't know us, so they decide, instead of killing the little girl, they'll tie her up with duct tape.
They taped her up and sat her down in front of a television to be found by the police later on.
By the grace of God, she was able to untie herself, and 20 hours later, she was able to pick up that phone.
But there's still one big question on the minds of investigators. Why?
They believe the story as far as the facts of how this murder played out, but they still need the answers to the ultimate question.
How did they plan this? Who else was involved?
That's when Raphael drops the ultimate bombshell.
This was a contract hire, and they were only supposed to kill Carmen at the orders of Maria de Jesus.
He said, Maria. I said, Maria. He goes, yeah, upstairs, Maria, 3rd floor. I mean, we were shocked.
One week after beloved grandmother Carmen Quinones and her boyfriend Ruben Frederick were found brutally stabbed to death, New York detectives have a 10-page confession from one of the killers.
Rafael Rios said he was paid to kill Carmen by her ex-husband's new wife, Maria de Jesus.
He said, Maria. I said, Maria. He goes, yeah, upstairs, Maria, 3rd floor. I mean, we were shocked.
She was like this little short, I don't even think she was 5 feet tall.
You have this person who is presenting as this sweet lady, and so they moved on because her disposition didn't raise any red flags.
I knew of Maria and Justino, of course, but their involvement, I'm like, no, it can't be.
However, the more Raphael talks, the more detectives believe him. Raphael explains he first met Maria de Jesus years ago when they were neighbors.
Maria lived in the same building that Mundo and Doggy lived in the Bronx. That's how she knew them. That's how she knew they were bad guys.
So when Maria needed hitmen to carry out her sordid plan, she knew just where to find them.
He said she came over to the Bronx, looked for us, and she said, I need somebody killed. And I'll pay a lot of money.
She offered to pay $15,000 for it.
They were paid to kill Carmen. And unfortunately, Ruben was there too. He wasn't supposed to be there, And he paid the price with his life.
But why did Maria want Carmen killed in the first place?
I'm like, why? He goes, I don't know. I think she doesn't like her. I said, wow, it's pretty deep. And he goes, I don't know. I think something happened a long time ago.
But before investigators move in on Maria, there's one more person they need to find. Raphael's accomplice, Raymond Mundo.
They eventually locate him 135 miles away in Connecticut.
We knew that he was in Connecticut because we had tracked his cell phone there.
However, Raymond isn't going down easy.
When Raymond spots the police, he takes off and tries to carjack a vehicle from a pregnant woman.
He opens the door, tries to grab her out of the car. By that time, we all surrounded him.
Get hands in the air! Hands in the air!
Finally, Raymond realizes his time is up.
We hook him up, we cuff him, and then he was brought into the Connecticut State Police. He realized the gig was up because his accomplice confessed.
After receiving a nearly identical confession from Raymond, police begin digging deeper into Maria de Jesus's involvement.
The detectives definitely have enough information here to arrest both Raymond and Raphael. They don't have enough information to arrest Maria because Maria's only being pulled into this on the word of a convicted criminal.
So they continued to work the case to try and get more evidence on Maria.
We needed more evidence. We needed bank records. We needed phone records.
And in Maria's bank records, something quickly catches detectives' attention.
The bank records showed that she had withdrawn in 2 increments, but totaling $15,000 around the same time that Raphael said this payment was made to them.
There's no way that's just a coincidence in their eyes.
On June 4th, police finally move in to arrest Maria de Jesus at the same brownstone where Carmen Quinones and Ruben Frederick were brutally murdered.
We knew she was there. So I kept on pressing the buzzer. Maria, it's Detective Rivera. You know, we need to talk. She finally answered.
Hello?
I said, Maria, you're under arrest. You have to come. She says, okay. I think she was waiting because she thought maybe she was going to get that knock on the door, and she did.
She was that small little woman that they wrote off immediately in the top of the investigation, and she's living rent-free in a home. So, like, what's the issue that Carmen had to be killed by her, and for $15,000 nonetheless?
Prosecutors finally answer that question when Maria stands trial 2 years later, revealing a major piece of the puzzle. Justino and Maria had been a couple before Carmen came into the picture.
The motive in this case is pure jealousy. Turns out, all those years ago, before Carmen and Justino got married, he had been dating Maria.
Maria dated Justino when they were young. We believe that she was still mad at Carmen because Carmen married Justino. When Carmen and Justino couldn't be together anymore for whatever reasons, he got back with Maria and they married.
And since Carmen and Justino have a rent-free arrangement, Maria had to live in the same building as her arch nemesis.
The fact that she had to see this woman every day, I don't know. That's a big grudge to have.
To prove that Maria was the mastermind behind the murders, prosecutors present her bank records to the court.
They had the bank receipts that she took out $15,000.
And that payment matched up with the agreed-upon amount for this murder for hire.
This was a contract killing.
Maria, she wanted that brownstone, and it was just something that she thought she could get away with. And she set this plot in motion.
But most damning of all is Rafael Rios's testimony.
Raphael makes a plea deal with the prosecution to testify against Maria, and his testimony is really the nail in her coffin.
She's convicted of murdering Carmen Quinones and Ruben Frederick. She's sentenced to life without parole.
She may not have been the one who did the stabbing, but she's the one who was the mastermind.
But while Maria de Jesus is convicted of the merciless crime, investigators are convinced her husband Justino had nothing to do with it.
No one could ever find any nexus between Justino and the ill-fated, devious plans of Maria, you know. She was just an evil gargoyle, that woman.
As for Raymond Mundo, he's tried separately and also found guilty.
He goes to trial, and he's ultimately convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
So Maria and Raven are sentenced to life without parole. But due to his cooperation, Raphael only gets 23 years. Is it enough? That's still up for debate.
This act was pure evil, powered by hatred, pure hatred.
This murder of Carmen Quinones and Ruben Frederick was, it was a horrific case. It is one of those cases that stays with you, stays with you for the rest of your life.
It's just a lot of loss. You can never be too sure about the company that you keep.
On the morning of July 15th, still 1992, one of London's most familiar green spaces became the setting for a crime that would haunt Britain for decades. Wimbledon Common was already awake. Dog walkers crossed damp footpaths. Early runners moved through the trees. Parents pushed strollers beneath a quiet summer sky. It looked like an ordinary Wednesday, the kind of morning that disappeared into memory before lunchtime. But before the day was over, that illusion would be shattered forever. A young mother lay mortally wounded in a secluded clearing, only a short distance from paths used by hundreds of people every day. Beside her stood her 2-year-old son, physically unharmed yet too young to explain what had happened. The image would become one of the most unforgettable scenes in modern British criminal history. It appeared to be the kind of case that detectives believed could be solved quickly. The attack had happened in daylight. The location was public. Forensic evidence had been recovered. Witnesses had been in the area. Yet what followed was not a rapid arrest, but one of the longest and most controversial murder investigations Britain had ever witnessed. For 23 years, the identity of the killer remained unknown, while the investigation itself became a story of missed opportunities, disputed investigative methods, and the evolving power of forensic science. When the truth finally emerged, it did not simply identify a murderer. It forced the nation to reconsider everything it thought it knew about the case that had once seemed impossible to solve. Rachel Nichol was 23 years old. Friends described her as intelligent, warm, and deeply devoted to her young son, Alexander. She lived in South London and often visited Wimbledon Common, a vast stretch of woodland, grassland, and walking trails that served as one of the capital's most popular open spaces. Thousands of Londoners knew the Common as a place of escape from city life. Families picnicked there. Children played among the trees. Joggers followed familiar routes. Dog owners gathered every morning in routines that rarely changed. It was precisely because the location felt so ordinary that the crime sent such powerful shockwaves through the country. Violence of this nature was expected in dark alleyways or isolated industrial districts, not in a park where parents believed their children were safe. The attack challenged assumptions about public safety and transformed a place associated with peace into one associated with fear. That Wednesday morning began like many others. Rachel left home with Alexander for what appeared to be a routine walk across the Common. Nothing suggested danger. The weather was mild, encouraging more visitors than usual. The familiar paths gave every appearance of normality. Witnesses later remembered seeing people scattered throughout the area, each following their own daily routines. No one could have imagined that within minutes an act of extraordinary violence would unfold only a short distance away. According to the evidence established during the investigation, Rachel was attacked in a secluded area of the Common. She sustained multiple stab wounds in a brutal assault that shocked even experienced investigators. Alexander remained near his mother after the attack. When other visitors eventually discovered the scene, emergency services were summoned immediately, but Rachel could not be saved. Her son survived physically unharmed, though the psychological consequences of witnessing such an event at such a young age would become part of the tragedy remembered by the public. News of the murder spread rapidly across Britain. Newspapers interrupted ordinary headlines with urgent reports from Wimbledon. Television bulletins opened with updates from the crime scene. Radio broadcasts repeated the same disturbing facts throughout the day. A young mother had been murdered in broad daylight. Her small child had been present. The killer had escaped without being identified. Those simple facts alone were enough to grip the nation's attention. As journalists arrived outside the police cordons, images of forensic officers working methodically across the woodland began appearing on television screens across the country. White protective suits moved carefully through the undergrowth. Detectives photographed every inch of the scene. Specialists searched for fibers, footprints, fingerprints, and biological evidence that might identify the attacker. Every detail seemed significant because investigators believed they were dealing with a murderer who had left traces behind. The investigation immediately became one of the Metropolitan Police's highest priorities. Detectives established a major incident room and assembled experienced homicide investigators alongside forensic specialists. Hundreds of officers were assigned to the inquiry. Every witness who had been on Wimbledon Common that morning became potentially important. Appeals for information appeared across newspapers and television. Anyone who had seen suspicious behavior was urged to contact police immediately. Officers knocked on doors throughout surrounding neighborhoods. Thousands of statements were eventually collected. Maps of the Common were examined repeatedly as detectives reconstructed movements of walkers, cyclists, joggers, and drivers. Every reported sighting was placed into a developing timeline. The hope was straightforward. Somewhere among the ordinary routines of hundreds of people, someone had unknowingly seen the man responsible. The crime scene itself presented both opportunities and challenges. Investigators recovered biological material believed to belong to the attacker. In 1992, DNA profiling was already an established forensic technique in Britain, but it remained far less advanced than it would become decades later. Scientists understood that the recovered samples could eventually prove decisive if the correct suspect were identified. However, possessing DNA evidence and identifying its owner were two entirely different challenges. National databases were still limited in size. Genetic genealogy did not yet exist as an investigative tool. Detectives could compare evidence against known suspects, but if the killer had never provided a DNA sample to authorities, identifying him became vastly more difficult. The technology held enormous promise, but it could not yet answer every question. Meanwhile, public anxiety intensified. Wimbledon Common remained physically open, yet emotionally transformed. Visitors who had once wandered freely now looked over their shoulders. Parents questioned whether they should allow children to play alone. Women reconsidered walking isolated paths even during daylight hours. Newspapers published maps of the attack location alongside photographs of police searches. The murder dominated conversations far beyond London. It became symbolic of a wider fear that random violence could occur anywhere, even in places regarded as safe. The emotional impact extended well beyond Rachel's family. Entire communities experienced the unsettling realization that ordinary routines could be shattered without warning. As investigators examined Rachel's final movements, they also studied reports of unusual behavior on the Common before the murder. Detectives explored whether the attack had been planned or opportunistic. Had the killer selected Rachel specifically, or had she simply crossed paths with a stranger looking for a victim? Witness accounts varied. Some described unfamiliar men seen walking through wooded areas. Others recalled nothing unusual at all. Human memory proved unreliable, especially after widespread media coverage introduced new details into public discussion. Detectives understood that every widely reported fact risked influencing future witness recollections. Sorting reliable observations from mistaken assumptions became an increasingly complex task. Media attention grew more intense with each passing day. Front pages featured Rachel's smiling photograph beside headlines questioning how such a crime could happen in one of Britain's best-known public parks. Television crews broadcast from outside Scotland Yard and from Wimbledon Common itself. Criminal psychologists, former detectives, and legal commentators offered competing theories. Some believed the killer would strike again. Others argued that he might disappear permanently after committing a single murder. Public speculation expanded faster than confirmed evidence. Rumors circulated widely, many unsupported by facts. The detectives found themselves balancing two competing priorities, encouraging witnesses to come forward while preventing misinformation from overwhelming the investigation. Rachel's family faced unimaginable grief under relentless public attention. Every statement they released reflected hope that someone, somewhere, possessed information capable of identifying the killer. Friends remembered her kindness, her love for Alexander, and the ordinary future that had been stolen in a matter of minutes. Their loss became inseparable from the broader national story unfolding around the investigation. For millions watching from home, Rachel ceased to be merely another name in a newspaper. She became the face of an unresolved tragedy that challenged confidence in the criminal justice system's ability to deliver answers. Inside the investigation, detectives confronted the uncomfortable reality that solving murders depends not only upon determination, but upon evidence, technology, and timing. Every day that passed without an arrest increased the possibility that memories would fade, witnesses would become harder to locate, and physical evidence would lose context. Yet investigators remained convinced the case was solvable. They possessed forensic material. They believed the attacker had almost certainly been seen before or after the crime. They expanded inquiries into known violent offenders, examined previous sexual assaults, reviewed reports from neighboring police forces, and searched for behavioral similarities that might connect Rachel's murder to other crimes. Thousands of names entered investigative files. Hundreds were examined in detail. None produced the breakthrough detectives desperately needed. Few people realized during those first weeks that the Rachel Nichol investigation would eventually become remembered not only because of the murder itself, but because of the extraordinary decisions that followed. Decisions that would generate years of controversy, reshape investigative practices, and delay justice for more than 2 decades. At that moment, however, none of those future developments were visible. Britain saw only a grieving family, a frightened public, an enormous police operation, and a killer who had vanished into the ordinary crowds of London, leaving behind a crime scene filled with unanswered questions and a single promise from investigators that they would not stop searching until the person responsible was finally identified. The days that followed the murder unfolded beneath an atmosphere unlike anything Wimbledon Common had experienced before. Police tape had disappeared, but the sense of normality had not returned. Every pathway carried a different meaning. Every patch of woodland seemed capable of hiding secrets. People who had walked those trails for years without a second thought suddenly altered their routines, choosing wider paths, avoiding isolated areas, or abandoning the common altogether. The fear extended beyond South London. Across Britain, newspapers questioned whether anyone could truly feel safe in a public park again. Television cameras returned repeatedly to the same location where forensic officers had worked only days earlier, reinforcing a haunting reality. The crime scene had been cleaned, but the memory remained untouched. Detectives understood that fear alone could not solve a murder. They needed evidence that would withstand scrutiny in court, and they needed it quickly. The first stage of every major homicide investigation is often the most critical. Witnesses remember more. Physical evidence is freshest. Suspects are more likely to make mistakes. Every hour matters. In Rachel Nichol's case, the investigation moved with extraordinary urgency, but each promising lead seemed to dissolve just as quickly as it appeared. The major incident room became the nerve center of an operation involving hundreds of officers. Walls filled with maps, timelines, photographs, witness statements, and lists of potential suspects. Telephones rang continuously as members of the public responded to appeals for information. Detectives sorted through thousands of calls, separating credible observations from misunderstandings, speculation, and deliberate false reports. Every caller believed they possessed something important. Some claimed they had seen a man running from the common. Others remembered suspicious vehicles parked nearby. A few insisted they recognized the killer from composite descriptions circulating in the media. Each report required assessment. Even the smallest detail could potentially become the missing piece investigators needed. Officers began reconstructing Rachel's final morning with remarkable precision. They retraced her route through Wimbledon Common, calculating approximate walking times between footpaths and open spaces. They interviewed regular visitors who might have crossed paths with her. Dog walkers, cyclists, groundskeepers, joggers, maintenance staff, and nearby residents all became part of the investigation. Detectives sought to identify everyone known to have been in the area between the early morning hours and the discovery of the attack. They compared statements repeatedly, searching for overlapping observations that might reveal a consistent pattern. In theory, someone had almost certainly encountered the offender before or after the murder. The challenge lay in identifying which encounter mattered among hundreds of ordinary interactions that occurred every morning on the common. Witnesses described seeing unfamiliar individuals wandering through wooded areas, but the descriptions rarely matched one another perfectly. One remembered dark clothing, another focused on facial hair. A third recalled someone behaving nervously near a footpath. Human memory is influenced by stress, distance, lighting, and the passage of time. Detectives understood these limitations. They also recognized another danger. Once newspapers began publishing possible descriptions, witnesses could unintentionally merge their own recollections with information they had read or seen on television. Every public appeal risked both helping and complicating the investigation. Police therefore approached witness interviews carefully, attempting to preserve original memories before outside influences reshaped them. Meanwhile, forensic specialists continued examining every item recovered from the crime scene. Clothing, biological samples, vegetation, soil, and trace materials underwent detailed laboratory analysis. By the standards of the early 1990s, British forensic science ranked among the most advanced in the world. DNA profiling had already demonstrated its extraordinary potential in previous criminal investigations. Scientists knew the biological evidence collected from Rachel's murder could one day identify the offender with exceptional certainty. Yet technology still depended on one essential requirement. There had to be someone against whom the evidence could be compared. DNA databases remained relatively small compared with those that would exist decades later. If the murderer had never entered the criminal justice system in a way that required providing a DNA sample, investigators possessed no automated method of discovering his identity. The evidence existed, but it remained connected to an unknown individual. As the inquiry expanded, detectives explored whether Rachel's murder might be linked to previous sexual assaults or violent attacks committed in parks across London. Criminal analysts examined reports involving lone female victims, particularly incidents occurring near woodland or open spaces. They searched for similarities in offender behavior, victim selection, timing, and methods of attack. Every unsolved case became relevant. Every convicted offender with a history of sexual violence entered police databases for review. Officers visited prisons to interview inmates who claimed knowledge of the murder. Some prisoners attempted to trade fabricated information for reduced sentences or favorable treatment. Others simply repeated rumors already circulating in newspapers. Investigators learned quickly that high-profile cases attract individuals seeking attention as well as those genuinely attempting to help. Public pressure mounted with each passing week. Editorials criticized the absence of arrests. Television discussions questioned whether enough police resources had been allocated. Politicians commented on public safety without interfering directly in the investigation. Rachel's murder had become more than a criminal case. It represented a national concern. Parents discussed it at school gates. Employers spoke about it during lunch breaks. Evening news broadcasts returned repeatedly to Wimbledon Common, reminding viewers that a killer remained unidentified somewhere within the community. Detectives felt that pressure every day. They understood that expectations were immense. Yet homicide investigations cannot be solved through urgency alone. Facts determine outcomes, not headlines. Among investigators, one question gradually became increasingly important. Was the offender someone already known for violent sexual crimes? Or had an apparently ordinary individual committed an act no one had previously suspected him capable of carrying out? Both possibilities carried significant implications. If the murderer already possessed a criminal history, identifying him might depend upon reviewing existing records. If he did not, detectives faced a vastly more difficult challenge. An unknown offender without prior convictions could move unnoticed through everyday life while investigators searched endlessly among familiar names. Psychological profilers were consulted as part of the inquiry. Behavioral analysis had gained increasing attention during the late 20th century, influenced partly by developments in the United States. Profilers examined crime scene evidence, offender actions, victim circumstances, and patterns observed in previous violent crimes. Their assessments did not identify individuals directly. Instead, they attempted to describe likely characteristics of the unknown offender, offering investigative guidance rather than definitive conclusions. Such assessments remained controversial even within law enforcement. Supporters viewed them as valuable investigative tools. Critics warned against placing excessive confidence in behavioral predictions that could never substitute for physical evidence. In Rachel Nichols' investigation, profiling would eventually assume extraordinary significance, though few outside the investigation appreciated its growing influence during these early stages. The media's fascination with the case continued expanding. Newspapers devoted extensive coverage not only to developments, but also to Rachel herself. Friends and relatives described her personality, her relationship with Alexander, and her plans for the future. These stories humanized the tragedy while simultaneously intensifying public determination to see justice achieved. Yet increased publicity produced unintended consequences. The detectives received more calls than ever before, many sincere, some speculative, and others entirely false. Resources that might otherwise have focused exclusively upon investigative work were increasingly consumed evaluating information generated by media attention itself. The emotional weight carried by officers working the case also grew heavier. Many had investigated murders before, but few involved circumstances as heartbreaking as those found on Wimbledon Common. Experienced detectives later acknowledged that Rachel's young son remained impossible to forget. The knowledge that a toddler had survived physically while witnessing unimaginable violence affected investigators profoundly. It strengthened their commitment to solving the case, yet it also heightened frustration whenever promising leads collapsed under scrutiny. Extensive house-to-house inquiries continued across surrounding neighborhoods. Detectives examined employment records, interviewed local workers, and investigated individuals reported for unusual behavior before or after the murder. Composite sketches were produced based on witness descriptions considered potentially reliable. Officers distributed information throughout London and beyond, hoping recognition might trigger new leads. Thousands of investigative actions accumulated within expanding files. Every document represented time, effort, and hope. Most ultimately produced nothing capable of identifying the offender. At the same time, scientific evidence remained preserved with extraordinary care. Investigators understood that forensic technology evolves. Even if current methods failed to produce answers, future advances might reveal information impossible to obtain in 1992. Biological samples were therefore retained under conditions designed to preserve their integrity indefinitely. That decision reflected foresight rather than certainty. No one could predict precisely how forensic science would develop over the coming decades, but experienced investigators recognized that evidence unavailable today might become decisive tomorrow. Despite relentless effort, weeks gradually turned into months without the breakthrough everyone expected. The murder weapon had not been recovered. No eyewitness could confidently identify the attacker. No confession emerged. No indisputable suspect stood before detectives. Instead, the investigation accumulated possibilities without resolution. Public confidence began shifting from expectation toward anxiety. If such a high-profile murder, supported by substantial police resources and modern forensic techniques, could remain unsolved, what did that imply about the limits of criminal investigation itself? Inside Scotland Yard, determination hardened rather than weakened. Senior investigators refused to accept failure. They believed the answer remained somewhere within the evidence already collected or among individuals not yet fully examined. The inquiry, therefore, entered a new phase, one increasingly shaped by behavioral theories, psychological interpretation, and an expanding search for men whose backgrounds appeared capable of matching the unknown offender. Among those names, one individual would soon emerge as the overwhelming focus of police attention. His life would become inseparable from the Rachel Nicholl investigation, setting in motion one of the most controversial chapters in British criminal justice, a chapter that would influence policing practices for years to come and ultimately demonstrate how even the most determined investigations can be led far from the truth when certainty begins to outpace evidence. As the investigation moved beyond its initial surge of activity, the atmosphere inside the incident room began to change. The enormous volume of witness statements had been organized. Forensic reports had been reviewed repeatedly. Detectives had interviewed hundreds of people and examined countless lines of inquiry. Yet the central question remained exactly where it had been on the morning of July 15th, SIL 1992. Who had killed Rachel Nicholl? Every unsolved homicide eventually reaches a difficult crossroads, a point where the obvious investigative avenues have been exhausted and the remaining possibilities become increasingly uncertain. In the Rachel Nicholl inquiry, that moment arrived far sooner than anyone had hoped. Public pressure continued to intensify, political attention remained fixed on the case, and newspapers demanded visible progress almost every day. The expectation that police would quickly identify the killer had slowly transformed into frustration that they had not. Within that climate, investigators searched relentlessly for any lead capable of breaking the deadlock. Attention increasingly turned toward men who had histories of sexual offending, violence, or behavior that investigators considered unusual. The detectives reviewed intelligence files, examined reports from psychiatric institutions, consulted probation services where legally appropriate, and revisited information gathered during earlier inquiries. Thousands of names circulated through the investigation. Most were eliminated after routine checks. Some remained under observation longer because they had been present in the area or possessed criminal histories that appeared relevant. The process was painstaking, and officers understood that suspicion alone could never substitute for evidence. Nevertheless, major investigations often require detectives to prioritize individuals whose backgrounds appear consistent with the available facts. The challenge lies in ensuring that investigative focus does not become investigative certainty before the evidence justifies it. One name gradually attracted increasing attention: Colin Stagg, a young man living not far from Wimbledon Common. Stagg came to police attention through information developed during the investigation and because aspects of his personal life and interests were viewed by investigators as potentially relevant. He was known to walk on the common. He had an interest in outdoor survival and carried camping equipment during some of his walks. Personal writings recovered during the investigation reflected fantasies and interests that detectives regarded as unusual and disturbing. Importantly, however, unusual interests and criminal guilt are not the same thing. At that stage, investigators possessed no forensic evidence linking Stagg to Rachel Nicholl's murder. They had not found fingerprints placing him at the scene. The available DNA evidence did not identify him. There was no eyewitness who could reliably state that he had committed the crime. Even so, suspicion surrounding him continued to grow within parts of the investigative team. Behavioral analysis played an increasingly significant role in shaping that suspicion. Criminal profiling was receiving considerable attention during the early 1990s, and investigators sought assistance from specialists who attempted to interpret offender behavior based upon crime scene characteristics. Profiling was never intended to identify a specific individual. Rather, it sought to suggest general personality traits, behavioral tendencies, or lifestyle characteristics that might help narrow investigative focus. In Rachel Nichols' case, certain aspects of the profile were viewed by some investigators as appearing broadly consistent with Colin Stagg's lifestyle and interests. That perceived consistency strengthened police interest, even though profiling itself could not establish guilt and was never a substitute for direct evidence. As surveillance increased, officers quietly observed Stagg's movements, routines, and associations. His daily life became the subject of intense scrutiny. Detectives examined his background, interviewed people who knew him, and searched for any evidence connecting him to Rachel or placing him definitively at the crime scene. Yet, despite months of investigation, the essential problem remained unchanged. No conclusive evidence emerged. The forensic material recovered from Wimbledon Common did not identify him. Witness testimony remained inconclusive. The investigation had produced suspicion, but suspicion could not sustain a murder prosecution on its own. For detectives facing enormous public pressure, this presented a profound dilemma. They believed they might have identified the right individual, yet they lacked the evidence required to prove it. Every passing month increased concerns that the case might remain permanently unsolved. Rachel's family continued waiting for answers. The public continued demanding accountability. Newspapers questioned whether the investigation had stalled. Against that backdrop, investigators considered increasingly unconventional methods in an effort to determine whether Colin Stagg could be connected more directly to the murder. The Metropolitan Police authorized an undercover operation that would later become one of the most controversial investigative tactics in modern British policing. The operation, known by the codename Operation Edzell, involved an undercover female police officer assuming a false identity and attempting to establish a relationship with Stagg. The objective was not simply conversation. Investigators hoped he might make incriminating admissions if he believed he had formed a romantic connection with someone who appeared to share extreme sexual interests. The undercover officer corresponded with him through letters before meeting him in person. Their conversations were carefully planned and monitored by investigators. The strategy reflected investigative thinking of the period, but it also carried extraordinary legal and ethical risks. Undercover policing has long been recognized as a legitimate investigative technique in certain circumstances. However, there are important legal boundaries. Officers may gather evidence, but they must not improperly induce individuals to confess falsely or commit crimes they would not otherwise have committed. Maintaining that distinction proved critical in assessing everything that followed. Over weeks and months, the undercover officer engaged Stagg in increasingly personal discussions. Correspondence included references to sexual fantasies and occult themes because investigators believed such subjects might encourage him to reveal hidden knowledge if he were the murderer. Throughout the operation, Stagg responded to many conversations openly, sometimes discussing his fantasies and personal beliefs. Yet despite extensive interaction, one fact remained remarkably consistent. He did not confess to murdering Rachel Nichols. Investigators hoped for a direct admission or some piece of non-public information that only the killer could know. That moment never arrived. Instead, the operation generated conversations that later became the subject of intense legal examination. Detectives interpreted certain responses as suspicious. Defense lawyers would later argue that investigators had become so convinced of Stagg's guilt that they interpreted ambiguous statements in the light most favorable to their existing theory. The distinction between suspicion and proof grew increasingly blurred. Eventually, police decided they had sufficient grounds to arrest Colin Stagg. In August 1993, more than a year after Rachel's murder, he was charged with the offense. The announcement generated enormous national attention. Many observers assumed that the long search had finally reached its conclusion. Headlines suggested that Britain's most notorious unsolved murder had been cracked. Television crews assembled outside court buildings. Rachel's family understandably hoped justice might finally be within reach after months of uncertainty. Yet beneath the public optimism, serious legal questions already surrounded the case. prosecutors faced the difficult task of presenting evidence capable of surviving judicial scrutiny. Unlike many homicide prosecutions, the case against Stagg did not rest upon definitive forensic proof. The DNA evidence recovered from the crime scene did not establish that he was the source, nor was there an eyewitness capable of identifying him as the attacker. Much of the prosecution's argument relied upon the undercover operation and investigators' interpretation of his behavior. As pretrial proceedings unfolded, the court examined not only the evidence itself, but also the methods used to obtain it. The undercover operation received especially close attention. Judges considered whether investigators had acted within acceptable legal boundaries or whether the tactics employed had gone too far. These questions carried implications extending well beyond Rachel Nichols' case. They touched upon fundamental principles of criminal justice, including fairness, reliability, and the proper limits of undercover policing. When the matter came before the court, the outcome proved devastating for the prosecution. The trial judge ruled that the undercover operation had been conducted in a manner that rendered the evidence obtained through it inadmissible. The judge expressed serious concern about the methods used and concluded that the police had effectively attempted to entice rather than simply observe. Without that evidence, the prosecution's case collapsed. Colin Stagg was formally acquitted before facing a jury because the remaining evidence was insufficient to support a realistic prospect of conviction. The decision sent shockwaves through Britain. For Rachel's family, it represented another crushing disappointment. They remained without answers. For the Metropolitan Police, it became a deeply embarrassing setback in one of the country's highest-profile murder investigations. For Colin Stagg, the consequences extended far beyond the courtroom. Although acquitted, years of intense public suspicion had transformed his life. His name had become inseparable from one of Britain's most notorious murder cases, despite the absence of evidence sufficient to establish his guilt in court. The collapse of the prosecution forced investigators into an uncomfortable position. They had devoted enormous resources to pursuing one suspect, only to see the case unravel under judicial examination. Valuable time had passed. Public confidence had been damaged. Most importantly, Rachel Nichols' murderer remained unidentified. In hindsight, the proceedings marked a turning point rather than an ending. The investigation would eventually move away from Colin Stagg, and years later, he would receive compensation after legal action relating to the consequences of the failed prosecution. More importantly, subsequent developments in forensic science would demonstrate that the investigation had focused on the wrong individual altogether. But none of that was yet known. As the courtroom emptied and headlines shifted from anticipated justice to controversy, one undeniable fact remained. The person who had attacked Rachel Nichols on a summer morning in Wimbledon Common was still free. Somewhere beyond the arguments over undercover tactics, legal rulings, and public debate, the true killer continued living an ordinary life while one of Britain's most famous murder investigations found itself forced to begin searching once again, burdened now not only by an unsolved crime, but also by the consequences of one of the most controversial investigative decisions in modern British policing. The collapse of the prosecution against Colin Stagg did more than end a criminal case. It fundamentally altered the direction of one of Britain's largest murder investigations and exposed painful questions about how certainty can take hold long before proof exists. Inside Scotland Yard, detectives faced a reality that few major investigative teams ever wished to confront. After months of surveillance, interviews, behavioral analysis, undercover operations, and extensive public attention, they were no closer to identifying Rachel Nichols' killer than they had been during the first chaotic days after her death. The enormous investment of time and resources had not produced a conviction. More importantly, it had not produced reliable evidence identifying the person responsible. The inquiry had reached a point where investigators had to ask an uncomfortable question. Had they spent so much time pursuing one suspect that other possibilities had quietly slipped into the background? Public confidence suffered a significant blow. Newspapers that had once reported confidently on the investigation now questioned the methods used by police. Editorials debated whether the pressure surrounding Rachel's murder had influenced investigative decision-making. Legal commentators discussed the balance between solving serious crimes and preserving the integrity of criminal justice. The discussion extended far beyond Wimbledon Common. Detectives across Britain watched closely because the issues raised by the case affected policing nationwide. Undercover operations remained legitimate investigative tools, but Rachel Nichols' case demonstrated how easily those methods could become the subject of judicial criticism if investigators appeared to move beyond gathering evidence into encouraging potentially unreliable admissions. For Rachel's family, however, these debates offered little comfort. Their loss remained exactly as it had been on that July morning. Courtroom decisions could not change the fact that Rachel had been murdered in broad daylight, nor could they explain why the person responsible remained unidentified. Every anniversary of her death renewed media attention. Each newspaper article reminded the public that one of Britain's most shocking murders remained unsolved. Alexander, who had been only 2 years old at the time of the attack, continued growing up under circumstances no family should ever experience. The passage of time changed many aspects of the investigation, but it could not erase the human cost left behind. Following the failed prosecution, detectives were forced to reassess the entire inquiry. Major case reviews became increasingly common in complex investigations during the 1990s, particularly when significant developments failed to produce successful prosecutions. Senior officers examined investigative decisions, reviewed witness statements, reconsidered forensic evidence, and asked whether important opportunities had been overlooked. Such reviews were not admissions of failure. Rather, they reflected recognition that fresh perspectives can reveal details previously hidden beneath assumptions formed during earlier stages of an inquiry. The forensic evidence recovered from Wimbledon Common remained one of the investigation's most valuable assets. Although technology available in 1992 had been unable to identify the unknown contributor of the biological material, scientists recognized that future advances might produce results impossible to achieve at the time of the murder. Accordingly, evidence continued to be preserved carefully. Every biological sample, every exhibit, every laboratory record remained available for future examination. Experienced investigators understood that unsolved cases often depend not only upon persistent detective work, but also upon scientific progress that cannot be hurried. Meanwhile, the true offender remained unidentified, and that uncertainty presented another challenge. Detectives had to consider whether the killer had committed additional crimes before or after Rachel's murder. If the attack formed part of a broader pattern of violent offending, identifying similarities with other investigations could become crucial. Police analysts therefore revisited unsolved sexual assaults, attempted murders, and homicides from across London and surrounding regions. They searched for recurring behavioral characteristics while recognizing an important limitation. Criminal behavior varies considerably between offenders, and even the same individual may not commit every offense in exactly the same manner. Similarities may indicate a connection, but they do not prove one. Investigators also examined whether advances in offender databases might assist the inquiry. During the years following Rachel's murder, the United Kingdom expanded its use of DNA profiling considerably. The national DNA database grew steadily as legislation evolved and more samples became available from qualifying individuals. Each expansion increased the possibility that DNA recovered from older crime scenes might eventually match someone newly entered into the system. Yet despite these developments, no immediate breakthrough emerged in Rachel's case. The unknown DNA profile remained exactly that known. Outside official investigations, the case continued, attracting widespread public interest. Books, documentaries, newspaper retrospectives, and television discussions revisited the murder repeatedly. Some focused upon Rachel's life and the tragedy of her death. Others examined the investigation itself, particularly the failed prosecution of Colin Stagg. Public fascination persisted because the case combined several powerful elements rarely found together: a shocking crime committed in daylight, an apparent abundance of forensic evidence, a controversial investigation, and an unresolved ending. The absence of definitive answers encouraged endless speculation, much of it unsupported by evidence. Police remained cautious regarding speculation. Investigators understood that widespread publicity could generate useful information, but it could also produce misinformation capable of diverting valuable resources. Every anniversary prompted fresh appeals for witnesses. Detectives hoped that changing personal circumstances might persuade someone previously reluctant to speak. Relationships change over time. Friendships end. Loyalties weaken. Individuals once afraid to contact police sometimes become willing years later. Cold case investigations often depend upon exactly such shifts in human behavior. Nevertheless, despite repeated appeals, no decisive witness emerged. Within forensic science, however, change continued at a remarkable pace. Laboratories refined methods for analyzing increasingly small biological samples. DNA profiling became more sensitive and more reliable than investigators in 1992 could have imagined. scientists developed techniques capable of extracting useful genetic information from evidence previously considered too limited or too degraded for meaningful examination. Every technological advance encouraged renewed optimism among detectives responsible for unsolved cases. Evidence preserved decades earlier suddenly possessed renewed investigative potential. By the early years of the 21st century, police forces across Britain had established specialized units dedicated to reviewing unresolved murders. These teams approached investigations differently from the original detectives. They were not constrained by assumptions formed during the emotional intensity of the initial inquiry. Instead, they examined evidence with the benefit of hindsight, modern forensic capabilities, and years of accumulated investigative experience. Rachel Nichols' murder naturally became one of the cases receiving continued attention. Review teams carefully reconstructed every stage of the original investigation. Witness statements were reread, timelines were verified, exhibits were re-examined. Detectives asked whether advances in technology justified further laboratory testing. Importantly, these reviews also acknowledged the lessons learned from earlier investigative decisions. Modern homicide investigations increasingly emphasize the importance of allowing evidence to determine investigative direction rather than permitting theories to dictate interpretation of evidence. Rachel's case had become an enduring reminder of the risks associated with allowing investigative confidence to outpace objective proof. Attention gradually returned to the forensic material collected in 1992. Scientists recognized that although earlier comparisons had failed to identify the unknown contributor, newer analytical techniques might produce stronger or more complete DNA profiles. These improved profiles could then be compared against a far larger national database than had existed at the time of the murder. Detectives authorized additional examinations, understanding that scientific advances often arrive incrementally rather than through dramatic breakthroughs. Each refinement increased the possibility that one day the unknown profile might finally correspond with a known individual. At the same time, developments in forensic psychology encouraged investigators to reconsider behavioral evidence with greater caution. Profiling remained a potentially useful investigative aid, but it was increasingly understood that behavioral assessments should inform investigations rather than define them. Rachel Nichols' investigation had become one of several cases frequently discussed during professional training, illustrating both the potential value and the limitations of psychological analysis. The distinction between investigative guidance and evidential proof became more clearly recognized throughout British policing. Years continued passing. London itself changed dramatically. New buildings appeared. Technology transformed daily life. Mobile phones, digital communication, and widespread surveillance cameras altered criminal investigations in ways unimaginable in 1992. Yet one location remained permanently connected to an unanswered question. Visitors walking through Wimbledon Common often had no personal memory of Rachel Nichols' murder, but those familiar with the case understood that somewhere among the trees, history had been interrupted by violence whose consequences continued echoing decades later. For Rachel's family, patience became an unavoidable burden. Every fresh review offered renewed hope, yet every year without resolution risked deepening despair. Families of homicide victims frequently describe unsolved cases as existing in a permanent state of incompleteness. Time moves forward for everyone else, but unanswered questions remain frozen. Justice delayed does not erase grief. It merely extends uncertainty. Unknown to investigators during many of these years, the biological evidence collected on the morning of July 15, SIL 1992, still contained the key to identifying the killer. The science required to unlock that evidence had not existed when Rachel was murdered. It had not existed when Colin Stagg came under suspicion. It had not existed during the failed prosecution that dominated headlines throughout Britain. But scientific progress does not remain still. Quietly, year after year, laboratories refined techniques, databases expanded, and forensic capabilities advanced toward a point where evidence preserved from one summer morning in Wimbledon Common would finally begin revealing answers that had remained hidden for more than 2 decades, transforming one of Britain's most infamous cold cases and demonstrating that while memories fade and investigations stumble, carefully preserved evidence can continue waiting in silence until science finally learns how to hear what it has been saying all along. Time has a strange effect on unsolved murders. Public attention gradually fades, newspaper headlines become archive material, and the investigators who once spent every waking hour on a case eventually retire or move on to new assignments. But evidence does not grow old in the same way people do. A carefully preserved DNA sample remains silent, unchanged, waiting for the moment when science becomes capable of asking it better questions. By the early years of the 21st century, that moment was beginning to arrive. Across Britain, cold case investigations were being transformed not by dramatic confessions or chance eyewitnesses, but by steady advances inside forensic laboratories. DNA analysis had become significantly more sensitive than it had been in 1992. Scientists could obtain usable genetic profiles from samples that earlier generations of forensic experts had considered incomplete or unsuitable for comparison. At the same time, the National DNA Database had expanded dramatically, containing far more profiles than investigators could ever have imagined when Rachel Nichols was murdered. Every new addition increased the possibility that an unknown offender from the past might one day unknowingly identify himself simply by entering the criminal justice system for an entirely different matter. Within the Metropolitan Police, specialist officers responsible for reviewing unresolved murders understood that Rachel Nichols' case remained among the most important investigations awaiting renewed forensic examination. It was not simply because of its public profile. The case possessed something many older investigations lacked: preserved biological evidence believed to originate from the offender. Detectives knew that physical evidence has an advantage over human memory. Witnesses forget details. Recollections become uncertain. People move away or die. DNA, however, does not become less truthful with time. If preserved correctly, it retains exactly the same information it contained on the day it was collected. The challenge lies not in preserving the evidence, but in developing scientific methods capable of interpreting it with greater precision. The review process proceeded methodically. Investigators resisted the temptation to search immediately for dramatic conclusions. Instead, they returned to the fundamentals of the case. Every exhibit recovered from Wimbledon Common was cataloged once again. Laboratory records created in 1992 were compared with modern forensic standards. Specialists evaluated whether additional testing might produce stronger DNA profiles than those available during the original investigation. Nothing was assumed. Nothing was accepted merely because earlier investigators had reached certain conclusions. Modern cold case reviews increasingly emphasized objectivity. Every decision had to be driven by evidence rather than expectation. As these scientific reassessments continued, another important development influenced the inquiry. Advances in offender database management allowed detectives to conduct broader and more sophisticated comparisons than had been possible during the early 1990s. DNA profiles recovered from unsolved crime scenes could be checked repeatedly as databases expanded. A profile that produced no match one year might identify an offender several years later if that individual's DNA entered the system following an unrelated criminal investigation. The detectives therefore recognized that persistence itself had become an investigative strategy. Rather than conducting a single comparison and closing the matter, they could continue reviewing evidence as technology and databases evolved. Meanwhile, discussions surrounding the original investigation had begun influencing police training throughout Britain. The failed prosecution of Colin Stagg was increasingly examined not merely as a legal controversy, but as an educational case study. Detectives learned valuable lessons about confirmation bias, the psychological tendency to interpret information in ways that reinforce existing beliefs. Investigators are trained to develop theories, but they are equally trained to challenge those theories continually. Rachel Nichols' investigation illustrated the dangers that arise when evidence appears to support expectations rather than expectations remaining subject to evidence. These lessons would later shape investigative practices far beyond London. Public interest in Rachel's murder never disappeared entirely. Documentary programs revisited the case. Newspapers marked significant anniversaries by interviewing retired detectives, legal experts, and forensic scientists. Each retrospective highlighted both the brutality of the crime and the unanswered questions that continued surrounding it. Viewers often expressed astonishment that a murder committed in broad daylight in one of London's busiest public parks remained unresolved despite extensive forensic evidence. The apparent contradiction fascinated the public. How could so much evidence coexist with so few answers? For Rachel's family, however, the passage of time remained measured differently. Anniversaries represented not historical milestones, but personal reminders of absence. Every renewed media discussion reopened painful memories while simultaneously offering another possibility that someone might finally provide information leading to justice. Families connected to long-term unsolved cases often describe living between hope and resignation, never entirely abandoning either. Rachel's case became one of Britain's most enduring examples of that emotional reality. As forensic specialists continued their work, investigators also reconsidered offenders who had been active during the early 1990s but had not previously attracted significant attention in Rachel's case. This process did not involve random speculation. Instead, detectives reviewed individuals convicted of violent sexual offenses whose movements, criminal histories, or behavioral characteristics warranted renewed examination in light of updated forensic evidence. The objective was not to fit evidence to suspects, but to determine whether modern scientific methods could objectively eliminate or implicate individuals previously beyond the reach of available technology. One aspect of modern forensic science distinguished it sharply from the methods available during the original investigation. Improved DNA analysis could produce more complete genetic profiles, reducing ambiguity and strengthening comparisons. Equally important, laboratories adopted increasingly rigorous quality assurance procedures to ensure that conclusions rested upon reliable scientific foundations. Every stage of testing underwent careful documentation. Independent verification became standard practice. The lessons learned from previous controversial investigations reinforced the necessity of allowing science to speak with clarity rather than permitting investigators to interpret uncertain results too confidently. During this period, detectives remained aware that identifying the offender represented only one part of the challenge. Even if a DNA match eventually emerged, prosecutors would still need sufficient evidence to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. They would have to explain how the suspect became linked to Rachel, evaluate any potential innocent explanations for forensic findings, and reconstruct events from evidence collected decades earlier. Successful cold case prosecutions therefore require extraordinary coordination between forensic scientists, detectives, prosecutors, and legal experts. Every conclusion must withstand intense scrutiny because the passage of time inevitably complicates criminal proceedings. Technological progress continued steadily. DNA profiling became capable of extracting increasingly detailed information from biological material once considered marginal. Sophisticated computer systems accelerated comparisons against expanding databases. Laboratories reduced processing times while improving analytical precision. These advances occurred gradually rather than dramatically. There was no single invention that transformed every investigation overnight. Instead, years of incremental scientific improvements collectively expanded what became possible. Behind the scenes, Rachel Nichols' case benefited directly from those developments. The preserved biological evidence underwent renewed analysis using methods unavailable in 1992. Scientists worked carefully, conscious that many exhibits could never be replaced if damaged during testing. Every procedure required meticulous planning. Detectives understood that the evidence represented their strongest opportunity to identify the unknown offender. There would be no second chance. As laboratory work progressed, investigators also maintained contact with Rachel's family, providing updates when appropriate while recognizing the emotional burden created by repeated reviews. Families in cold case investigations often experience renewed hope whenever fresh forensic examinations begin. Investigators therefore approached communication cautiously, avoiding promises they could not guarantee. Scientific testing sometimes produces breakthroughs. At other times, it confirms only that questions remain unanswered. Outside official circles, relatively few members of the public realized that the investigation had entered a significant new phase. Unlike dramatic arrests or courtroom proceedings, forensic reassessment occurs quietly. There are no televised searches, no daily press conferences, no obvious signs that a case is moving forward. Scientists work behind laboratory doors, examining microscopic evidence whose significance may not become apparent for months or even years. Yet history demonstrates repeatedly that some of the most important developments in criminal investigations occur precisely in these silent environments, far removed from cameras and headlines. By now, more than a decade had passed since Rachel's murder. London itself had changed enormously. New technologies shaped everyday life. Police investigations increasingly relied upon digital records, mobile telephone analysis, and sophisticated forensic databases that barely existed when the original inquiry began. Nevertheless, one crucial piece of evidence remained exactly as it had been preserved in July 1992. The unknown DNA profile still belonged to a man whose identity had never been established. Detectives understood that patience remained essential. Every improvement in forensic capability increased confidence that answers might eventually emerge. They no longer viewed the investigation through the same lens as investigators during the early 1990s. Instead of relying heavily upon behavioral theories or speculative interpretations, the modern review focused overwhelmingly upon objective scientific evidence. That shift reflected broader changes throughout criminal investigation, emphasizing measurable facts over intuition whenever possible. The transformation was gradual, almost invisible to the public, but it represented a profound change in investigative philosophy. Rachel Nichols' case had already influenced policing through the lessons learned from its earlier controversies. Now it stood on the threshold of influencing history once again, this time through the remarkable capacity of modern forensic science to reveal truths hidden within evidence preserved for decades. Somewhere within the carefully stored biological material recovered from Wimbledon Common lay the identity of the man detectives had failed to find in 1992. The evidence had never disappeared. It had never become less reliable. It had simply been waiting for science to become sophisticated enough to reveal what it had silently contained from the very beginning, bringing investigators closer than ever before to answering a question that had haunted Britain for more than 20 years. More than 2 decades had passed since Rachel Nichols was murdered on Wimbledon Common, yet the investigation refused to become merely another unsolved file stored in an archive. Inside the Metropolitan Police, the case remained active, carried forward by detectives who had not stood at the original crime scene, but who inherited the responsibility of finding answers. They approached the investigation with a significant advantage unavailable to their predecessors. They possessed not only preserved evidence, but also the benefit of hindsight. They knew where earlier investigative strategies had failed. They understood the controversy surrounding the unsuccessful prosecution of Colin Stagg. Most importantly, they recognized that any future breakthrough would have to rest upon objective forensic evidence capable of surviving the closest legal scrutiny. Every lesson learned during the previous 2 decades pointed toward the same conclusion. The solution would not come from speculation, psychological interpretation, or investigative instinct alone. It would have to come from science. By the early 2010s, forensic DNA analysis had advanced to a level unimaginable in 1992. Laboratories could produce more complete genetic profiles from extremely small biological samples, while improvements in analytical software reduced uncertainty and strengthened statistical confidence in DNA comparisons. Equally transformative was the continued expansion of the United Kingdom's national DNA database. Millions of profiles had been added over the years, dramatically increasing the likelihood that biological evidence recovered from historic crime scenes might eventually correspond with someone already known to the criminal justice system. Detectives responsible for reviewing Rachel Nichols' murder understood that every improvement in database coverage represented another opportunity. A profile that had produced no match in previous years could suddenly identify an offender if circumstances changed. Specialist forensic scientists therefore returned once again to the evidence collected from Wimbledon Common. The biological material recovered during the original investigation underwent renewed examination using updated laboratory techniques, designed to maximize the quality of genetic information extracted from preserved samples. Every procedure followed strict scientific protocols. Documentation remained meticulous. Independent verification accompanied each significant analytical stage. After the controversy surrounding earlier investigative methods, everyone involved understood the importance of ensuring that conclusions rested upon evidence alone. As scientists refined the DNA profile recovered from the crime scene, detectives prepared for several possible outcomes. The first possibility was straightforward, a direct match within the national database. The second involved partial similarities that might require further investigation. The third, and perhaps most frustrating, remained the absence of any meaningful result. Investigators had experienced disappointment before. They knew that even improved technology could not guarantee success. Nevertheless, optimism remained stronger than at any previous point in the inquiry. Then, after years of waiting, the investigation finally began moving in a new direction. The enhanced forensic work identified a DNA profile suitable for renewed comparison against available records. This development did not immediately solve the case, but it fundamentally altered the investigation. The detectives now possessed stronger scientific evidence than ever before. The unknown contributor remained unidentified, yet the profile itself had become more informative, increasing the possibility that future comparisons would succeed. At the same time, investigators widened their review of offenders convicted of serious violent and sexual crimes during the years following Rachel's murder. They examined individuals whose criminal histories, geographical movements, or offending patterns justified renewed attention. Unlike earlier stages of the inquiry, these reviews remained firmly grounded in forensic evidence. Detectives avoided allowing behavioral similarities alone to dictate investigative priorities. Instead, DNA became the central reference point against which every potential suspect would ultimately be measured. One name gradually emerged through this process: Robert Napper. Unlike Colin Stagg, Napper already possessed an extensive history of violent criminal behavior. During the years following Rachel's murder, he had committed a series of serious sexual offenses and violent attacks. Most notably, he had later been identified as the man responsible for the 1993 murder of Samantha Bissett and her 4-year-old daughter Jasmine in southeast London. Following those crimes, Napper had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and detained indefinitely within a secure psychiatric hospital after legal proceedings concerning his mental condition. His history of violent offending and documented movements during the relevant period inevitably attracted renewed investigative attention. Importantly, detectives did not immediately conclude that Napper was responsible for Rachel's murder. They had learned the dangers of premature certainty. Instead, they approached the possibility systematically. Investigators reconstructed his known activities during the early 1990s, reviewed previous intelligence, examined archived investigative material, and, above all, sought forensic comparisons capable of either excluding or implicating him objectively. The significance of Napper's criminal background lay not merely in the seriousness of his offenses, but in the fact that biological samples relating to him were available for lawful forensic comparison. Detectives no longer depended primarily upon witness recollections or behavioral theories. They possessed the opportunity to compare preserved crime scene DNA directly against a known individual using scientific methods far superior to those available 20 years earlier. Laboratory scientists proceeded cautiously. DNA comparisons in major criminal investigations undergo exceptionally rigorous quality control because the consequences of error are profound. Multiple analysts independently reviewed results. Statistical calculations assess the probability of coincidental matches. Every stage required documentation capable of withstanding examination in court by forensic experts representing both prosecution and defense. Scientific certainty could not be assumed. It had to be demonstrated. When the comparison was completed, investigators finally received the breakthrough that generations of detectives had been pursuing since the summer of 1992. The DNA recovered from Rachel Nichols' murder matched Robert Napper. After more than 2 decades, objective forensic evidence had identified the unknown man whose biological material had remained preserved from the original crime scene. For investigators, the moment carried extraordinary significance. Yet despite the emotional impact of finally identifying a suspect, detectives continued proceeding with remarkable caution. They understood that establishing a DNA match represented a crucial milestone, not the conclusion of the investigation. Prosecutors would require a comprehensive evidential case explaining the circumstances of the offense, the forensic findings, and Napper's connection to the crime. The detectives therefore continued gathering supporting evidence while carefully reviewing every aspect of the inquiry. The discovery also forced investigators to confront difficult questions regarding the original investigation. Could Robert Napper have been identified much earlier? Had opportunities existed that were overlooked? These questions demanded careful historical analysis rather than speculation. Reviews examined available intelligence from the early 1990s, recognizing that investigative resources, information systems, and forensic capabilities differed significantly from those existing 20 years later. Hindsight provides clarity unavailable to investigators working in real time. Nevertheless, the emergence of Napper inevitably prompted renewed examination of decisions made during the original inquiry. For Colin Stagg, the DNA breakthrough represented something equally important. Scientific evidence now demonstrated what he had maintained throughout the investigation. He was not Rachel Nichols' killer. Years of suspicion, intense media attention, and public scrutiny had profoundly affected his life, despite the collapse of the prosecution decades earlier. The forensic identification of Robert Napper removed any remaining uncertainty regarding responsibility for Rachel's murder. Evidence, rather than opinion, had finally resolved the central question. Public reaction proved immediate and intense when authorities announced the new forensic developments. Newspapers across Britain revisited every stage of the investigation, contrasting the failed prosecution of Colin Stagg with the decisive role ultimately played by DNA evidence. Commentators observed how advances in forensic science had succeeded where earlier investigative strategies had failed. Rachel Nichols' case rapidly became one of the country's most significant examples of the power of preserved biological evidence. In resolving historic murders, Rachel's family finally received the development they had awaited for more than 20 years. Although nothing could undo the events of July 1992, the identification of the man responsible ended decades of uncertainty. Families connected to cold cases often describe uncertainty itself as a second form of suffering. Not knowing who committed the crime or whether justice will ever be achieved prolongs grief indefinitely. The DNA breakthrough could not erase loss, but it replaced unanswered questions with established facts. Within policing and forensic science, the case assumed lasting importance. It demonstrated the necessity of preserving biological evidence even when contemporary technology appears insufficient to identify an offender. It reinforced the importance of periodic cold case reviews. It illustrated how advances in forensic science can transform investigations once considered unsolvable. Equally significantly, it reminded investigators of the need to distinguish carefully between suspicion and proof, ensuring that evidence, not assumptions, remains the foundation of every criminal inquiry. The long search for Rachel Nichols' killer had entered its final phase, not because memories had improved or because witnesses suddenly appeared after decades of silence, but because a microscopic fragment of biological evidence collected on a summer morning in Wimbledon Common had patiently endured the passage of time. For more than 20 years, it had contained the answer investigators sought. It had waded through public controversy, failed prosecutions, changing investigative teams, evolving technology, and countless reviews. At last, science had become capable of hearing what that evidence had been saying all along, opening the path toward the final legal chapter in one of Britain's most haunting murder cases. The DNA identification of Robert Napper transformed the Rachel Nichols investigation, but it did not immediately conclude the legal process. Detectives had finally answered the question that had dominated the case for more than 20 years, yet criminal investigations do not end with scientific certainty alone. Evidence must be assembled into a form capable of meeting legal standards. Prosecutors must evaluate whether proceedings are appropriate, and courts must determine how justice should be administered. In Napper's case, those questions carried additional complexity because of his established psychiatric history and his existing legal status following earlier violent offenses. Investigators therefore entered the final stage of the inquiry with the same caution that had characterized the forensic review. The mistakes of the past had demonstrated the consequences of moving faster than the evidence. This time, every decision would be measured carefully. By the time Rachel Nichols' murder was formally linked to Robert Napper through DNA evidence, he was already being detained indefinitely at a high-security psychiatric hospital under legal provisions related to his mental condition. Years earlier, legal proceedings concerning the murders of Samantha Bissett and her 4-year-old daughter Jasmine had established that he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, a serious mental illness that significantly affected the legal handling of those offenses. As a result, prosecutors considering Rachel's case faced circumstances very different from those surrounding a conventional murder prosecution. The central issue was no longer identifying an unknown offender. Instead, it involved determining the appropriate legal process in light of established forensic evidence and Napper's psychiatric condition. The detectives continued reviewing every available piece of evidence connected to Rachel's murder. Although the DNA findings were compelling, investigators sought to present the strongest possible evidential picture. They revisited witness statements, reconstructed Napper's known movements during the relevant period, reviewed historical intelligence, and carefully documented how the forensic comparisons had been conducted. Every scientific conclusion required transparent explanation. The investigation had already become one of the most scrutinized homicide inquiries in British history, and prosecutors understood that every aspect of the case would receive intense legal examination. The renewed investigation also prompted extensive internal reflection within the Metropolitan Police. Senior officers acknowledged that Rachel Nichols' murder represented not only a forensic success, but also a painful reminder of investigative shortcomings during the original inquiry. Reviews examined how attention had become concentrated upon Colin Stagg, while the actual offender remained unidentified. These assessments were conducted not to rewrite history, but to improve future investigative practice. Criminal investigations inevitably involve uncertainty, yet the Rachel Nichols case demonstrated how confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret information in ways that reinforce existing beliefs, can influence even experienced investigators if sufficient safeguards are not maintained. Independent observers reached similar conclusions. Legal scholars, policing experts, and forensic specialists analyzed the investigation as a landmark case illustrating both the strengths and limitations of modern criminal justice. On one hand, The preservation of forensic evidence ultimately delivered the correct answer despite the passage of more than 2 decades. On the other, the failed prosecution of Colin Stagg highlighted the importance of ensuring that investigative theories remain continually tested against objective evidence rather than gradually becoming accepted as established fact. For Colin Stagg himself, the identification of Robert Napper represented long-awaited vindication. Although the prosecution against him had collapsed in 1994, public suspicion had lingered for years. His name remained associated with one of Britain's most notorious murder investigations, despite the absence of evidence proving his involvement. The eventual DNA identification of Napper fundamentally altered public understanding of the case. It demonstrated conclusively that investigators had pursued the wrong man. Stagg later received compensation following legal proceedings concerning the consequences of the failed investigation, though financial awards could never fully erase the personal impact of years spent under intense public suspicion. Meanwhile, Rachel's family prepared themselves for another legal process, one very different from the courtroom proceedings many had imagined during the early 1990s. After waiting more than 20 years for definitive answers, they now faced the prospect of hearing the evidence presented within the framework of proceedings involving an individual already detained because of severe mental illness. The emotional complexity of that situation cannot be overstated. Justice means different things to different families. For some, it is a lengthy prison sentence. For others, it is simply knowing the truth. After decades of uncertainty, Rachel's family finally possessed that truth, even if the legal outcome would not resemble the conventional murder trial once anticipated. When formal proceedings relating to Rachel Nichols' murder moved forward, prosecutors relied heavily upon the strength of the forensic evidence. DNA analysis had established a direct scientific link between Robert Napper and the biological material recovered from the crime scene. Unlike the investigative theories that had dominated earlier stages of the case, DNA evidence rested upon measurable scientific comparison rather than subjective interpretation. It provided the objective foundation investigators had lacked throughout the original inquiry. During the legal process, Napper admitted responsibility for the unlawful killing of Rachel Nichols on the basis of diminished responsibility, reflecting the accepted medical evidence regarding his mental illness. The court accepted that plea, resulting in a conviction for manslaughter by reason of diminished responsibility rather than murder under English law. He received a hospital order ensuring his continued detention within secure psychiatric care. This outcome reflected legal principles governing cases involving defendants whose mental condition substantially affects criminal responsibility. It did not diminish the seriousness of Rachel's death. Rather, it represented the application of established legal standards to the specific medical evidence before the court. The conclusion of the proceedings finally brought formal legal recognition to what the forensic evidence had established. After 23 years, Rachel Nichols' case was no longer officially unsolved. The unknown DNA profile recovered from Wimbledon Common in 1992 now belonged to an identified individual whose responsibility had been established through modern forensic science and legal proceedings. One of Britain's most enduring criminal mysteries had finally reached its conclusion. Public reaction combined relief with reflection. Many newspapers focused not only upon Napper's identification, but also upon the extraordinary journey required to reach that point. Headlines contrasted the limitations of early forensic technology with the capabilities of modern DNA science. Commentators emphasized the importance of preserving biological evidence and revisiting unresolved investigations as scientific methods improve. Rachel Nichols' case rapidly became one of the clearest demonstrations that time does not necessarily weaken every criminal investigation. In certain circumstances, the passage of years can actually strengthen the search for truth by allowing science to develop beyond the limitations that existed when the crime occurred. Within forensic science, the investigation gained lasting significance. Laboratories cited the case when discussing long-term evidence preservation. Police training programs referenced it when emphasizing the importance of objective decision-making. Cold case units throughout the United Kingdom viewed the investigation as powerful evidence that historic murders should never be abandoned solely because immediate investigative opportunities have been exhausted. As long as evidence remains preserved, future technological advances may produce results impossible to achieve today. Yet alongside these positive lessons remained more difficult ones. Rachel Nichols' investigation continued serving as an enduring reminder of the human consequences associated with investigative error. Colin Stagg's experience demonstrated how profoundly suspicion can affect an innocent person's life even without a conviction. The case reinforced the importance of protecting legal safeguards designed to prevent prosecutions unsupported by reliable evidence. Those safeguards exist not to obstruct justice, but to ensure that justice identifies the correct individual. For detectives who had inherited the investigation decades after the murder, the resolution carried a unique emotional weight. Many had devoted years to reviewing evidence collected long before they joined the police service. They never experienced the frantic early weeks of the inquiry, the media pressure of the original investigation, or the courtroom controversy surrounding Colin Stagg. Instead, they relied upon patience, scientific advancement, and careful reassessment. Their work demonstrated that persistence in criminal investigation sometimes requires resisting dramatic theories in favor of quiet, methodical analysis extending across decades. As legal proceedings concluded, Wimbledon Common itself remained outwardly unchanged. Families still walked its paths. Runners crossed open fields. Dog walkers followed familiar routes beneath ancient trees. Visitors unfamiliar with the case saw only one of London's largest and most peaceful public spaces. Yet for countless others, the landscape retained a permanent historical significance. It had become inseparable from Rachel Nichols' memory and from the extraordinary investigation that followed her death. The resolution of the case did not erase the events of July 15th, still 1992. It could not restore a young mother whose life ended in devastating violence. It could not return the childhood altered forever by what Alexander witnessed that morning. Nor could it undo the years of uncertainty endured by Rachel's family or the consequences experienced by Colin Stagg after becoming the focus of a failed prosecution. What it did provide was something equally important within the criminal justice system, an evidence-based account of responsibility supported by science rather than speculation. After 23 years, Britain finally possessed an answer. Not a perfect ending, because no homicide investigation truly ends perfectly, but a truthful one. The silence that had surrounded the unknown DNA profile for more than 2 decades had finally been broken, revealing the identity of the man responsible and leaving behind a legacy that would influence policing, forensic science, and criminal investigation for generations to come. The legal resolution of Rachel Nichols' case marked the end of one investigation, but it also began a broader national conversation about how justice is pursued, how mistakes occur, and how scientific progress can reshape the outcome of even the most difficult criminal inquiries. Few homicide investigations in modern Britain have influenced policing as profoundly as the events that unfolded between July 1992 and the eventual identification of Robert Napper more than 2 decades later. The case became more than a story about a murder. It evolved into a case study examined by detectives, prosecutors, forensic scientists, judges, legal scholars, and police trainers across the United Kingdom. Every stage of the investigation contained lessons, some inspiring, others deeply uncomfortable, but together they transformed professional thinking about how major crimes should be investigated. Within the Metropolitan Police, senior officers acknowledged that Rachel Nichols' murder had exposed both strengths and weaknesses in investigative practice. On one hand, the preservation of biological evidence had ultimately allowed science to identify the offender despite the passage of 23 years. On the other, the original inquiry demonstrated how easily an investigation can become centered upon a single suspect before objective evidence fully supports that focus. The distinction between developing a working hypothesis and becoming committed to that hypothesis became one of the most important professional lessons drawn from the case. Detectives routinely generate theories during investigations. Effective investigators are expected to do so. The challenge lies in continually testing those theories against new evidence, even when the evidence points in an unexpected direction. Training materials developed during the years that followed increasingly emphasized the concept of investigative objectivity. Officers were reminded that every promising lead must remain subject to challenge rather than acceptance. Evidence inconsistent with prevailing theories deserves the same careful attention as evidence appearing to confirm them. Rachel Nichols' investigation illustrated the consequences of allowing confirmation bias to influence decision-making. Once investigators become convinced they have identified the correct suspect, there is always a risk that ambiguous information will be interpreted through that assumption. Modern investigative procedures therefore place considerable emphasis upon peer review, supervisory oversight, and independent assessment designed to reduce the likelihood of such errors. The case also highlighted the changing role of criminal profiling within homicide investigations. During the early 1990s, behavioral profiling attracted considerable public attention and growing interest among investigators. Television programs, books, and high-profile criminal cases contributed to perceptions that psychological analysis could identify unknown offenders with remarkable accuracy. Rachel Nichols' investigation demonstrated both the potential value and the limitations of profiling. Behavioral assessments can assist detectives by suggesting investigative avenues or identifying patterns worthy of exploration. They cannot establish guilt. They are tools intended to support investigations, not replace forensic evidence or direct proof. Following the controversy surrounding the original inquiry, police services increasingly clarified the appropriate role of behavioral science within major investigations. Forensic science emerged from the case with enhanced public recognition. Long before Rachel Nichols' murder, DNA profiling had already established itself as a powerful investigative technique. Yet the extraordinary resolution of her case demonstrated something different. It showed that forensic evidence could continue producing results decades after a crime occurred, provided that investigators preserved exhibits properly and laboratories continued advancing scientifically. This realization strengthened support for comprehensive evidence retention policies throughout the United Kingdom. Materials once considered unlikely to produce useful information were increasingly preserved because future technologies might reveal details impossible to detect at the time of collection. Cold case investigations benefited directly from these developments. Police forces expanded specialized review teams responsible for examining unresolved homicides using modern forensic techniques. Detectives working these units often approached historic investigations with fresh perspectives, free from assumptions formed during the emotional intensity of original inquiries. Rachel Nichols' case became one of several examples demonstrating that successful cold case work requires patience, meticulous documentation, and willingness to reconsider earlier conclusions in light of new scientific evidence. Across Britain, families connected to other unsolved murders found renewed hope as police announced fresh reviews of historic investigations supported by improved DNA technology. The legal profession also reflected extensively upon the investigation. Judges, prosecutors, and defense lawyers examined the undercover operation conducted during the original inquiry as an important illustration of the boundaries governing covert policing. Undercover officers remain essential in many criminal investigations, particularly those involving organized crime, terrorism, or serious violence. However, Rachel Nichols' case reinforced the principle that covert operations must gather evidence rather than improperly encourage incriminating behavior. Cortez emphasized that fairness within criminal proceedings protects not only defendants, but also the integrity of the justice system itself. Reliable convictions depend upon reliable evidence. For Colin Stagg, public attitudes gradually shifted as more people came to understand the full history of the investigation. Earlier media coverage had often focused upon his arrest and the allegations made against him. Following the identification of Robert Napper, attention increasingly turned toward the consequences of being wrongly suspected in one of Britain's most notorious murder investigations. Although no amount of public recognition could erase years of personal hardship, the eventual forensic resolution established beyond doubt that investigators had pursued the wrong individual. His experience remains one of the most frequently discussed examples in Britain of the importance of distinguishing suspicion from proof. Rachel's family, meanwhile, faced a different journey. The conclusion of legal proceedings did not bring closure in the simplistic sense often portrayed in fiction. Families affected by homicide frequently describe justice as providing answers rather than ending grief. Rachel remained absent. The years lost could never be recovered. Yet uncertainty, which had dominated more than 2 decades of their lives, finally gave way to established fact. They no longer had to wonder who was responsible. Scientific evidence had answered that question definitively. While grief remained permanent, uncertainty no longer was. The broader public also reconsidered Wimbledon Common itself. For many Londoners, the location had become permanently associated with Rachel Nichols' murder. Yet over time, the Common gradually resumed its role as one of the city's most valued public spaces. Families returned. Community events continued. Walkers and runners reclaimed familiar routes. The landscape itself had never been responsible for the tragedy. Nevertheless, the memory endured. Visitors aware of the case often paused to reflect that one ordinary summer morning had altered the history of that place forever. Advances in forensic genetics continued accelerating after the resolution of Rachel's case. Scientists refined methods for analyzing degraded biological material, interpreting complex DNA mixtures, and improving statistical evaluation of genetic evidence. Although these developments did not influence Rachel Nichols' investigation directly after its conclusion, The case continued serving as an important historical example, illustrating why such research matters. Every improvement in forensic capability carries the potential to resolve another long-forgotten investigation, identify another unknown victim, or exonerate another wrongly suspected individual. Police organizations throughout Britain incorporated lessons from the investigation into professional development programs. Detectives studying major crime investigation encountered Rachel Nichols' case not because it represented investigative perfection, but because it illustrated the complexity of real-world criminal inquiries. Cases rarely unfold according to simple narratives. Evidence evolves. Scientific capabilities change. Assumptions require constant reassessment. Success often depends as much upon recognizing earlier mistakes as upon making new discoveries. In that sense, Rachel Nichols' investigation became one of the most valuable educational resources available to future generations of homicide investigators. Internationally, the case attracted attention among forensic scientists and criminal investigators beyond the United Kingdom. Many countries faced similar challenges involving historic unsolved murders supported by preserved biological evidence. Rachel Nichols' case demonstrated that careful evidence retention combined with scientific persistence could produce results even after decades of apparent stagnation. Conferences discussing forensic science, criminal investigation, and cold case methodology frequently reference the investigation as an example of how technological progress can fundamentally alter the prospects of solving long-standing crimes. Perhaps the most enduring lesson concerned patience. Modern audiences often expect immediate answers. Television dramas resolve murders within hours. Digital technology creates an impression that every mystery can be solved instantly. Rachel Nichols' investigation demonstrated a different reality. Scientific progress occurs gradually. Criminal investigations sometimes require years of careful work rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Evidence may remain silent until technology develops sufficiently to interpret it. Justice, while delayed, can still emerge through persistence, discipline, and unwavering commitment to objective fact. The image that remained with Britain was not solely that of forensic laboratories or courtroom proceedings. It was the image of a young mother whose ordinary morning walk ended in extraordinary violence. A child left standing beside unimaginable tragedy, and a community whose sense of security changed forever. Those memories continued shaping public understanding of the case long after the legal process concluded. Rachel Nichols' name became permanently linked not only with one of Britain's most shocking murders, but also with one of its most significant demonstrations of the transformative power of forensic science. As the years continued passing, the investigation settled into history not forgotten, but remembered for reasons extending far beyond the crime itself. It stood as a reminder that justice depends upon more than determination. It depends upon evidence honestly interpreted, science patiently advanced, institutions willing to learn from error, and investigators prepared to follow facts wherever they led. Those principles, strengthened by the long search for Rachel Nichols' killer, would continue influencing criminal investigations across Britain long after the headlines faded, ensuring that the legacy of one tragic summer morning reached far beyond Wimbledon Common and into the future of modern forensic justice. For many investigators, the Rachel Nichols case eventually became something more than a solved homicide. It became a timeline of how criminal investigation itself evolved across a generation. Looking back from the perspective of the 21st century, it is difficult to appreciate just how different policing, forensic science, and information sharing were on that July morning in 1992. Britain stood on the edge of enormous technological change. Computers existed within police forces, but many investigative processes still relied heavily upon paper records, manual cross-checking, physical filing systems, and the experience of individual detectives. DNA profiling had already proven its remarkable potential, yet it remained a relatively young discipline compared with the sophisticated forensic infrastructure that would emerge over the following decades. Rachel Nichols' murder occurred at precisely the moment when traditional investigative methods and modern forensic science overlapped, revealing both the promise of new technology and the limitations that still existed. The crime scene investigation conducted at Wimbledon Common reflected the best available practices of its time. Forensic officers documented the area carefully, recovered biological material, photographed evidence, searched for footprints, fibers, and trace materials, and preserved exhibits with extraordinary attention to detail. Those decisions proved invaluable. Had the evidence been collected less thoroughly or stored less carefully, later scientific advances would have had nothing meaningful to analyze. Although investigators in 1992 could not identify the unknown DNA profile, they recognized its potential importance. Their commitment to preserving that evidence became one of the defining reasons the case was ultimately solved. It serves as a reminder that successful cold case investigations often begin with decisions made decades earlier by officers who may never personally witness the eventual breakthrough. At the same time, the investigation demonstrated the enormous pressures associated with high-profile homicide inquiries. Detectives rarely work in isolation from public expectations. Every major development attracts media attention. Every apparent delay invites criticism. Every investigative decision may eventually be examined by journalists, lawyers, politicians, and independent review bodies. Rachel Nichols' murder generated extraordinary national attention from the very beginning. The combination of a public location, a young child present at the scene, and the apparently random nature of the attack created intense emotional responses throughout Britain. Under those circumstances, investigators faced relentless demands for rapid results while simultaneously attempting to conduct an evidence-based inquiry. Balancing those competing pressures remains one of the most difficult aspects of modern homicide investigation. Another enduring lesson concerns the relationship between science and human judgment. DNA evidence eventually identified Robert Napper with remarkable precision, but science itself never conducted the investigation. Detectives determined which evidence should be submitted for analysis. Forensic scientists interpreted laboratory findings. Prosecutors assessed legal implications. Judges evaluated admissibility and legal responsibility. Every stage required human decision-making informed by professional standards. Rachel Nichols' case therefore illustrates not that technology replaces investigators, but that effective investigations depend upon productive collaboration between scientific expertise and careful detective work. Neither discipline succeeds alone. The investigation also accelerated discussion surrounding evidence preservation. Prior to the widespread success of modern cold case reviews, some older investigations suffered because exhibits had been discarded according to retention policies established before forensic science reached its current level of sophistication. Rachel Nichols' case demonstrated the opposite outcome. Careful preservation allowed future generations of scientists to examine material collected years earlier using technologies unavailable at the time of the offense. Police services increasingly recognized that biological evidence might retain investigative value indefinitely. Storage facilities expanded. Retention policies evolved. Detectives investigating serious offenses became even more conscious that evidence collected today may solve cases decades into the future. Legal professionals likewise studied the case extensively. The failed prosecution of Colin Stagg reinforced long-standing principles governing criminal procedure. Cortez must evaluate not only whether evidence appears persuasive, but also whether it has been obtained fairly and lawfully. Undercover policing remains an essential investigative technique, yet Rachel Nichols' case highlighted the importance of maintaining clear boundaries between observation and inducement. Judicial scrutiny of undercover operations became increasingly rigorous following the controversy surrounding Operation Edsel. Investigators continued employing covert tactics where appropriate, but with heightened awareness that improperly obtained evidence may undermine even the most determined investigation. Within academic circles, psychologists examined the investigation through the lens of cognitive bias. Confirmation bias, tunnel vision, and decision-making under uncertainty became recurring themes in professional literature discussing the case. Criminal investigations require detectives to develop theories explaining available evidence. Problems arise when those theories become resistant to contradictory information. Rachel Nichols' investigation demonstrated how sincere, experienced investigators can gradually become convinced of a suspect's guilt despite the absence of conclusive forensic support. Modern investigative training therefore increasingly emphasizes structured decision-making, peer review, and continual reassessment of assumptions. The objective is not to eliminate human judgment, an impossible task, but to strengthen safeguards against predictable psychological errors. Media coverage also underwent significant reassessment. During the early 1990s, newspapers and television broadcasts frequently relied upon anonymous investigative sources, speculation regarding suspects, and dramatic interpretations of developing evidence. As later forensic findings fundamentally altered public understanding of Rachel Nichols' murder, many commentators reflected upon the responsibilities accompanying crime reporting. Public interest in serious criminal investigations remains entirely legitimate. Yet premature conclusions may affect innocent individuals, influence witness recollections, and shape public opinion long before evidence has been tested within legal proceedings. The case encouraged broader discussion regarding responsible reporting during active investigations. For forensic scientists, Rachel Nichols' murder represented one chapter within a broader revolution transforming criminal justice worldwide. Throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries, advances in genetics fundamentally altered homicide investigation. Techniques capable of analyzing minute quantities of biological material expanded opportunities not only to identify offenders, but also to exonerate innocent individuals. Cases once regarded as permanently unsolved re-entered active investigation. Wrongful convictions established before the widespread use of DNA evidence underwent renewed examination. Rachel Nichols' case occupied a unique position within this transformation because it demonstrated both sides of forensic progress: the eventual identification of the true offender and the definitive exclusion of the wrong suspect. Cold case investigators frequently point to another important aspect of the inquiry: persistence. Solving historic murders rarely involves a single dramatic breakthrough. Instead, progress usually results from years of incremental work. Evidence is reviewed repeatedly. Databases expand gradually. Laboratory methods improve step by step. Investigative teams change as officers retire and new detectives assume responsibility. Rachel Nichols' investigation followed precisely that pattern. The final identification of Robert Napper reflected not one extraordinary moment, but decades of disciplined evidence preservation, scientific development, and investigative commitment extending across multiple generations of police officers. The case also influenced public understanding of mental illness within the criminal justice system. Robert Napper's psychiatric condition became an important legal consideration during proceedings concerning Rachel's death. English law distinguishes between establishing responsibility for unlawful killing and determining the appropriate legal outcome where severe mental illness substantially affects criminal responsibility. Public discussion surrounding the case often highlighted these distinctions, emphasizing that recognition of serious mental illness does not erase the suffering experienced by victims or diminish the gravity of violent offenses. Rather, it reflects legal principles governing how responsibility is assessed within specific medical circumstances. Rachel Nichols herself remained at the center of every discussion, despite the many investigative, scientific, and legal issues surrounding the case. Friends, relatives, and those who remembered her consistently emphasized that behind every forensic breakthrough stood the life of a young woman whose future ended abruptly on an ordinary morning walk with her son. It is easy, particularly in famous criminal investigations, for public attention to shift toward detectives, suspects, or courtroom proceedings. Rachel's family repeatedly reminded observers that the investigation existed for one reason alone: because a 23-year-old mother had been violently killed, leaving loved ones to endure decades of unanswered questions. Alexander's presence at the crime scene also remained one of the investigation's most haunting elements. Although he was physically unharmed, his survival profoundly influenced public perception of the case from the very beginning. Detectives, journalists, and members of the public alike found it impossible to separate the brutality of the attack from the knowledge that a small child had witnessed its aftermath. That image became permanently embedded within Britain's collective memory of the case, reinforcing why Rachel Nichols' murder continued resonating so powerfully long after countless other investigations had faded from public consciousness. Ultimately, the Rachel Nichols investigation became a story about truth emerging through patience rather than speed. It demonstrated that justice sometimes depends upon preserving questions until science becomes capable of answering them. It reminded investigators that confidence must always remain subordinate to evidence. It showed families connected to other unsolved murders that time alone does not necessarily destroy hope. And it established one enduring principle that continues guiding homicide investigations today: evidence, when protected carefully and examined honestly, can continue speaking across decades, revealing truths that no witness remembers, no suspect admits, and no investigator could discover until science finally catches up with the silent testimony left behind at the scene of a crime. Long after the court proceedings had concluded and the headlines announcing the identification of Robert Napper had faded from newspaper front pages, the Rachel Nichols case continued to resonate in a way few criminal investigations ever do. Some cases are remembered because of the violence of the crime itself. Others are remembered because of the person responsible or the legal precedent they establish. Rachel Nichols' murder occupies a unique place in British criminal history because it combined all of those elements with something even more enduring. It fundamentally changed the way many investigators, forensic scientists, and legal professionals thought about the pursuit of justice. It became a reminder that the path toward truth is rarely straightforward. Investigations can succeed in preserving evidence while failing in interpretation. Scientific breakthroughs can emerge decades after detectives have exhausted every available lead. Most importantly, the case demonstrated that the passage of time does not necessarily weaken the possibility of justice. In certain circumstances, time itself becomes an ally, allowing technology to solve questions that once appeared impossible. The transformation of forensic science during the years between 1992 and the eventual resolution of the investigation cannot be understood simply as a story of improved laboratory equipment. It represented a broader shift in how criminal evidence was approached. Early DNA profiling had already proven revolutionary, but it required relatively substantial biological samples and depended upon databases that remained limited in size. As the years passed, analytical techniques became increasingly sophisticated. Scientists learned how to recover reliable genetic information from smaller, older, and more degraded samples. Statistical interpretation improved dramatically, allowing experts to express conclusions with greater confidence while maintaining rigorous scientific standards. These advances affected countless criminal investigations across Britain, but Rachel Nichols' case became one of the clearest public demonstrations of their extraordinary practical value. The National DNA Database also expanded into one of the most significant investigative resources available to British policing. Every lawful addition increased the possibility that evidence recovered years earlier might eventually identify an offender. Unlike eyewitness memory, which generally weakens over time, the value of DNA evidence often increases as comparison opportunities expand. Rachel Nichols' investigation illustrated this principle perfectly. The biological material recovered from Wimbledon Common did not become more informative with age. Instead, the surrounding scientific environment evolved until investigators finally possessed the tools necessary to understand what the evidence had contained all along. Equally significant was the evolution of investigative culture. During the decades separating Rachel's murder from its resolution, British policing increasingly embraced structured review processes designed to minimize the influence of cognitive bias. Detectives remained encouraged to develop investigative theories, but they also became increasingly responsible for documenting alternative explanations, challenging assumptions, and seeking independent evaluation of major decisions. This cultural shift reflected lessons drawn not only from Rachel Nichols' investigation, but also from other complex criminal inquiries in which early assumptions later proved inaccurate. Modern homicide investigation increasingly recognizes that certainty should emerge from evidence rather than precede it. Rachel Nichols' case also reinforced the importance of multidisciplinary collaboration. Successful investigations rarely depend upon a single detective or a single scientific discovery. Instead, they require coordinated contributions from crime scene specialists, forensic biologists, DNA analysts, intelligence officers, behavioral experts, prosecutors, legal advisors, and experienced investigators capable of integrating enormous quantities of information. During the final years of the inquiry, forensic science provided the decisive breakthrough, but that breakthrough became meaningful only because earlier investigators had collected and preserved the evidence with exceptional care. The case therefore illustrates continuity across generations of professionals rather than the triumph of one individual over another. Within police training academies and specialist homicide courses, Rachel Nichols' investigation continues serving as an important educational resource. Trainees examine the chronology of the inquiry from the original crime seen through the failed prosecution of Colin Stagg and ultimately to the forensic identification of Robert Napper. Instructors emphasize not only the successes but also the mistakes. Professional learning depends upon both. Investigators are encouraged to recognize how public pressure, emotional commitment, media attention, and understandable determination to solve serious crimes can sometimes influence decision-making in subtle ways. Awareness of these pressures represents one of the strongest safeguards against repeating them. The case also shaped discussions regarding the ethical responsibilities accompanying forensic evidence. DNA possesses extraordinary persuasive power because of its scientific reliability, yet experts consistently remind Cortez that forensic evidence must always be interpreted within its proper context. A DNA match identifies biological association. Investigators must still establish how, when, and under what circumstances that biological material became connected to the crime. Rachel Nichols' investigation demonstrated the strength of forensic evidence precisely because detectives combined DNA findings with careful historical investigation rather than treating laboratory results as self-explanatory. Modern forensic practice continues emphasizing this balanced approach. For families connected to other unresolved investigations, Rachel's case became a source of cautious optimism. Organizations supporting victims' relatives frequently point to historic cases resolved through advancing forensic science as evidence. That hope should not disappear merely because years have passed. Every preserved exhibit represents potential. Every technological improvement creates new possibilities. Cold case investigators routinely acknowledge that scientific developments often succeed where traditional investigative methods have reached their limits. Rachel Nichols' murder became one of Britain's most compelling examples of that principle. Public memory of the case also evolved over time. During the early years, discussion centered primarily upon the shocking nature of the murder and the controversial investigation. Following the identification of Robert Napper, attention gradually shifted toward the remarkable role played by DNA evidence and the broader lessons learned. Documentaries, books, and academic analyses increasingly examined the investigation as an example of institutional learning rather than simply institutional failure. This distinction matters. The willingness of organizations to examine difficult experiences honestly often determines whether similar problems recur in the future. Wimbledon Common itself quietly reclaimed its identity as one of London's most treasured public spaces. The thousands of people who cross its paths each week often do so unaware of the history beneath their feet. Others remember exactly why the location became known throughout Britain. Memorials associated with criminal investigations rarely consist solely of physical objects. Sometimes they exist within collective memory, attached permanently to landscapes whose appearance remains unchanged while their meaning evolves. Wimbledon Common became one such place. The trees continued growing. Seasons continued changing. Families returned year after year. Yet for many, the memory of Rachel Nichols remained inseparable from the landscape itself. Rachel's legacy extends beyond criminal justice. Her case prompted conversations about public safety, media responsibility, investigative ethics, scientific innovation, and the treatment of families affected by violent crime. Each discussion reflects a different aspect of the investigation, yet all originate from the same tragic event that unfolded on a quiet July morning. Behind every procedural lesson stands the life of a young woman whose future ended unexpectedly, leaving those who knew her to navigate decades of grief while the search for answers continued. The investigation also demonstrated an often overlooked truth about justice. Resolution and healing are not identical. The identification of Robert Napper answered the central factual question surrounding Rachel's death. It established responsibility through objective forensic evidence and completed the legal process according to English law. Yet no investigation, however successful, can reverse the consequences of homicide. Families continue living with absence. Communities continue remembering. Investigators carry experiences from difficult cases throughout their careers. Justice provides accountability, but it cannot restore what violence has taken away. Looking back across more than 2 decades of investigation, one image remains particularly powerful. On the morning Rachel Nichols was killed, forensic officers collected biological evidence with professionalism and care, despite having no way of knowing whether contemporary science could ever identify the person who left it behind. They preserved that evidence because experience taught them that unanswered questions deserve future opportunities. Years later, scientists working in laboratories far removed from Wimbledon Common extracted answers from the very same material using techniques unavailable to those original investigators. The connection between those two moments, one at the crime scene, one decades later in a forensic laboratory, captures the essence of the entire investigation. Justice did not arrive because luck suddenly intervened. It arrived because evidence was respected, preserved, and revisited until science became capable of revealing its full significance. Rachel Nichols' murder therefore occupies a lasting place in the history of British criminal investigation. It reminds future generations that every exhibit collected today may become decisive tomorrow. It demonstrates that humility remains essential in detective work because early conclusions can later prove mistaken. It confirms that forensic science continues evolving in ways impossible to predict fully. Above all, it affirms that truth possesses remarkable endurance. Human memory fades. Public attention shifts. Investigators retire. Technologies become obsolete. Yet carefully preserved evidence retains its silent integrity. waiting patiently until the day when knowledge finally becomes sufficient to uncover the story it has been holding since the very beginning. When historians of British criminal justice look back on the Rachel Nicholl investigation, they often describe it not as a single case, but as several distinct investigations unfolding across different eras. The first belonged to the frantic days immediately following the murder, when hundreds of officers searched Wimbledon Common, interviewed witnesses, and believed the offender might be identified within hours or days. The second emerged as public pressure intensified, leading detectives toward controversial investigative strategies and ultimately to the unsuccessful prosecution of Colin Stagg. The third began quietly years later inside forensic laboratories and specialist cold case units, where advances in DNA technology gradually transformed preserved evidence into the key that finally identified Robert Napper. Each phase reflected the investigative tools, scientific knowledge, and professional culture of its own time. Together, they tell the story not only of one homicide, but of how criminal investigation itself matured over more than 2 decades. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the investigation is that the decisive evidence had existed from the very beginning. Unlike many historic murders that are solved through unexpected confessions or newly discovered witnesses, Rachel Nicholl's case contained the answer within the original crime scene. Detectives recovered biological material during the first stages of the inquiry, recognizing its potential importance even though they lacked the scientific capability to identify its owner. That distinction is crucial. The investigation did not succeed because investigators found new evidence years later. It succeeded because earlier investigators preserved existing evidence carefully enough for future generations of scientists to analyze it more effectively. In many ways, the officers working on Wimbledon Common in July 1992 unknowingly contributed as much to the eventual solution as the forensic specialists who later completed the DNA comparison. This continuity across generations illustrates one of the defining strengths of modern forensic investigation. Criminal cases do not belong exclusively to the detectives who first investigate them. Evidence can pass from one generation of investigators to another, carrying unanswered questions forward until knowledge advances sufficiently to resolve them. Rachel Nicholl's case demonstrated this principle with extraordinary clarity. Officers who had never met Rachel, never visited the original crime scene, and never participated in the early investigation ultimately played essential roles in identifying the offender. Justice became a collective achievement extending across decades rather than the accomplishment of any single individual or investigative team. The investigation also altered public understanding of cold cases. Before advances in forensic DNA analysis became widely recognized, many members of the public assumed that investigations left unsolved for many years had little realistic chance of resolution. Rachel Nicholl's case challenged that assumption. It demonstrated that the passage of time can actually improve investigative prospects under certain circumstances, particularly when preserved biological evidence exists and scientific methods continue advancing. This realization encouraged renewed examination of numerous historic investigations throughout Britain and beyond. Families connected to unresolved murders gained reason to believe that technological progress might eventually succeed where earlier efforts had failed. For forensic scientists, the case reinforced another essential principle. Meticulous documentation matters as much as sophisticated laboratory equipment. Every biological sample, every chain of custody record, every storage condition, and every analytical procedure contributed to the reliability of the final DNA identification. Scientific evidence derives its strength not only from technology, but from the integrity of the entire process surrounding its collection, preservation, and examination. Rachel Nicholl's investigation became an important example in forensic education because it illustrated how careful professional standards maintained over decades can preserve evidential value far into the future. Within policing, the investigation also encouraged broader institutional reflection concerning accountability. The Metropolitan Police publicly acknowledged shortcomings associated with aspects of the original inquiry, particularly the unsuccessful focus upon Colin Stagg. Such acknowledgement formed part of a wider professional recognition that effective organizations must learn openly from difficult experiences. Criminal investigations involve uncertainty, incomplete information, and enormous pressure. Mistakes may occur despite sincere efforts by dedicated professionals. The critical question becomes whether institutions respond by identifying lessons, improving procedures, and strengthening safeguards against repetition. Rachel Nicholl's case influenced each of those processes. The experience of Colin Stagg remains inseparable from that institutional learning. Although he was never convicted, the years following his arrest profoundly affected his life. Public suspicion, media attention, and the emotional burden of becoming associated with one of Britain's most notorious murder investigations continued long after legal proceedings against him collapsed. The eventual DNA identification of Robert Napper confirmed scientifically that investigators had pursued the wrong individual. Stagg's experience, therefore, serves as an enduring reminder that the consequences of investigative error extend far beyond courtroom outcomes. Reputations, livelihoods, and personal well-being may all be affected even when formal legal safeguards prevent wrongful conviction. The Rachel Nichols investigation likewise influenced conversations surrounding the relationship between policing and the media. High-profile criminal investigations inevitably attract extensive public interest, yet early reporting often occurs before investigators possess complete information. In Rachel's case, years separated initial speculation from eventual scientific certainty. That chronology highlighted the importance of distinguishing developing investigative theories from established fact. Responsible reporting cannot eliminate public curiosity, but it can help ensure that uncertainty is presented honestly rather than replaced prematurely by confident conclusions unsupported by evidence. As forensic technology continued advancing after the resolution of Rachel's case, investigators increasingly explored additional scientific techniques capable of assisting historic investigations. Enhanced DNA interpretation, improved methods for recovering trace biological material, digital reconstruction of crime scenes, and sophisticated analytical databases all expanded investigative possibilities. Rachel Nichols' investigation remained relevant because it